What if everything you see and feel could be deceiving you? That question gave rise to one of the most important movements in philosophy, rationalism. Thinkers like Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz believed that reason could lead us to universal truths, even when our senses fail us. Descartes took this idea to the extreme and found one certainty that seemed impossible to deny. I think, therefore I am. In this video, we'll explore how rationalism began, its main ideas, its greatest philosophers, and why this school of thought forever changed the way we think about knowledge, reality, and existence. After all, how much can we really trust our own reason? Rationalism begins with a fundamental question. How can we know that what we believe is actually true? For rationalists, observing the world is important, but relying only on the senses is not enough. We see, hear, touch, and experience reality, but what we perceive can change, differ from person to person, or even deceive us. Reason becomes the ability to move beyond appearances and search for principles that are more reliable, universal, and necessary. This does not mean that rationalists reject everything that comes from experience. Experience can tell us about particular events, while reason can reveal relationships that seem to remain true regardless of what happens around us. When we say that 2 + 2 = 4, we do not need to observe thousands of objects to make sure this relationship will continue to be true. We also do not need to repeat the experience tomorrow to find out whether the answer is changed. There is something necessary about this statement that seems to come from reasoning itself. This kind of certainty is what fascinates the great rationalists. For them, some truths do not depend entirely on what the senses show us. The mind has the ability to work with concepts, establish relationships, and reach necessary conclusions. Because of this, we can describe the rationalist spirit through a simple sequence: reason, universal principles, deduction, and necessary knowledge. We begin with foundations considered reliable, and through reasoning, draw conclusions that logically follow from them. Mathematics became a powerful model for this way of thinking. If the starting principles are correct, and the reasoning contains no mistakes, then the conclusion must follow. Many rationalists began to wonder whether philosophy could achieve a level of certainty similar to mathematics. This question appears very strongly in René Descartes, who is generally considered the founder of modern rationalism. In works such as Discourse on the Method and Meditations on First Philosophy, Descartes tries to find a truth so certain that no doubt could destroy it. Before building any philosophical system, he wanted to discover whether there was a reliable foundation on which everything else could be built. To do this, Descartes realized that he needed to question many things he had accepted as true throughout his life. Some beliefs came from education, others from tradition, and many came from the senses themselves. But the senses, although useful, sometimes deceive us. And while dreaming, we can sincerely believe that what we are seeing is real. Reason then takes on a critical role. It allows us to ask, what reasons do we really have for believing this? Descartes takes this investigation to the extreme through his famous method of doubt. He decides to temporarily doubt everything that can possibly be questioned, not because he wants to remain a skeptic, but because he wants to find something that cannot be denied. This path leads to the famous statement, "I think, therefore I am." Even if Descartes were being deceived about absolutely everything, one certainty would remain. In order to be deceived, he would have to exist as someone who thinks. If he doubts, he is thinking, and if he is thinking, he exists. The key point is that this first certainty was not discovered by observing an external object. It was found through the rational activity of consciousness itself. But modern rationalism does not end with Descartes. Baruch Spinoza took this confidence in reason in a different direction. His best-known work reveals this ambition in its very title, Ethics Demonstrated in Geometrical Order. Spinoza organizes his philosophy using definitions, axioms, propositions, demonstrations, and corollaries, deliberately making his work resemble the structure of geometry. This reveals a deep belief. For Spinoza, reality has an order that can be understood through reason. To know something properly means understanding its causes and seeing how it relates to the rest of nature. This confidence in reason even affects the way Spinoza understands our emotions. We often believe that we simply choose what we want, but we may not understand the causes that produce those desires. We can feel anger, jealousy, fear, or anxiety without fully understanding why those emotions appeared. For Spinoza, rationally understanding their causes increases our ability to deal with them. Reason, then, does not provide only abstract knowledge. It can also change the way we live. The third major figure of modern rationalism, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, adds another fundamental idea, the principle of sufficient reason. In simple terms, Leibniz argues that nothing happens without there being a sufficient reason for why it is this way rather than another. This does not mean that we can immediately explain everything that happens. It means that we should search for reasons, causes, and foundations, instead of treating reality as a random collection of events. This idea appears in works such as the Monadology and Discourse on Metaphysics. Leibniz believed that reality should be, at least in principle, understandable. When we encounter something that exists, the rational question does not end with, "That is just how it is." We can ask, "Why is it this way?" This willingness to search for explanations reveals one of the deepest characteristics of the rationalist mindset. Leibniz also makes an important distinction between truths of reason and truths of fact. Truths of reason are necessary. A triangle, for example, has 3 sides. A 4-sided figure simply would not be a triangle. Truths of fact, on the other hand, concern the way the world actually happened. A historical event happened in a certain way, but logically it could have happened differently. For this reason, rationalism does not simply mean being intelligent or thinking logically. It is a philosophical position about the origin and justification of knowledge. The central question is how far reason can go independently of experience, and which principles the mind itself can recognize as necessary. Descartes searches for a certainty that can survive doubt. Spinoza tries to understand the order and causes of reality through reason. Leibniz searches for the sufficient reasons that make things understandable. The 3 philosophers build very different systems, but they share one fundamental confidence. Reality does not have to be accepted only as it appears. It can be investigated through thought. Having an opinion is not the same as having knowledge. A statement can sound convincing, be repeated by thousands of people, and still have no solid justification. Rationalism requires us to ask which principles support what we believe, whether our arguments contain contradictions, and whether our conclusions truly follow from the premises we are using. That is exactly why the rationalist question remains so powerful. What reasons do you have for believing that what you consider true is actually true? From this question, rationalist philosophy turns reason into much more than an intellectual ability. It becomes a tool for looking beyond appearances, examining our own certainties, and searching for foundations strong enough to withstand questioning. Long before Descartes turned doubt into a method, Greek philosophy had already created a conflict between 2 ways of understanding reality. On one side was what the senses seem to show us. On the other was what thought requires for something to be considered true. At the center of this conflict stands Parmenides of Elea, one of the most radical thinkers of the ancient world and one of the deepest roots of the philosophical trust in reason. Parmenides lived between the 6th and 5th centuries BC in Elea, a Greek colony in southern Italy. His philosophy has survived through fragments of a poem known as On Nature. Instead of writing a traditional philosophical treatise, Parmenides presents a symbolic journey. This division is essential. The path of opinion represents the world as we normally perceive it. In this world, things seem to be born, change, move, and disappear. Everything around us suggests transformation. A child becomes an adult, a tree grows, an object wears out, and day turns into night. Our senses constantly seem to confirm that reality is always changing. Parmenides, however, asks an uncomfortable question. Should we accept these appearances simply because they seem obvious? His answer is no. For him, what appears to the senses does not automatically have the authority of truth. Thought must first examine what is logically possible before accepting what perception presents to us. This is where his most famous statement appears. What is. What is not, is not. At first, the statement may sound strange or even obvious. But Parmenides draws profound consequences from it. If something is, then it cannot simply be nothing. And what is not cannot be thought of as if it had existence. True thinking must remain connected to being, because trying to think about absolute non-existence would mean trying to think about something that cannot be. From this idea, Parmenides challenges the very concept of change. Think about something coming into existence. If something begins to exist, where did it come from? If it came from non-being, Parmenides considers that impossible because non-being is nothing. If it came from being, then in some sense it already belonged to what exists. The same problem appears with destruction. How could being completely turn into non-being? This line of reasoning leads Parmenides to a surprising conclusion. True reality, or being, neither begins nor disappears. It cannot come from nothing, because nothing can come from nothing. It also cannot stop existing by becoming nothing. Being, therefore, must be eternal, necessary, and unchanging. This conclusion directly conflicts with what our senses tell us every day. This is where Parmenides becomes important to the rationalist tradition. He was not a modern rationalist in the same sense as Descartes, Spinoza, or Leibniz. It would be historically inaccurate to simply place him inside a philosophical movement that would emerge many centuries later. His importance comes from establishing an attitude that would later become central. When there is a conflict between what the senses appear to show and what reason demonstrates to be necessary, reason may have greater authority. The problem becomes even deeper when we realize that the senses do not simply give us information. They give us appearances that must be interpreted. Seeing something happen does not necessarily explain what it really is. Thought looks for consistency, identity, and necessity. This is why Parmenides does not simply want to describe the world. He wants to discover what must be true for us to speak rationally about reality. In the poem on nature, the goddess presents the traveler with the reliable path of investigation. Thought must not follow what is not, because that path cannot lead to knowledge. The philosopher must remain connected to being. This requirement turns the logic of thought into a tool for investigating the very structure of reality. This point is fundamental, because with Parmenides, philosophy stops asking only what material the universe is made of, and begins investigating what it means to say that something exists. Before him, thinkers such as Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes tried to explain nature through fundamental principles. Parmenides moves the question to a more radical level. Before explaining how things change, we must ask whether change itself can be rationally understood. Empedocles, for example, would try to explain change through the combination and separation of permanent elements. Democritus would develop a view of reality made up of atoms that are never created or destroyed, even though their combinations produce visible changes. These responses show the power of Parmenides' problem. Even philosophers who disagreed with his conclusion still had to take his argument seriously. Plato was also deeply influenced by this tension. He would later distinguish between the world of the senses, which is constantly changing, and the intelligible realm of the forms, which are stable and universal. Although Plato does not simply repeat Parmenides, there is a clear connection in the idea that what the senses show us does not represent the whole of reality, and that the intellect can reach a more reliable level of knowledge. It is important to understand that Parmenides is not simply saying that our eyes sometimes make mistakes. His criticism is much more radical. The problem is not just that we might see an object incorrectly. The problem is that the entire world of the senses seems to present change and multiplicity, while his rational argument points toward a reality that cannot be born, disappear, or become something that it is not. This makes his philosophy almost uncomfortable. It forces us to choose between the immediate evidence of perception and the demands of reasoning. Even if we do not accept all of Parmenides' conclusions, his question remains powerful. When what we see conflicts with what seems logically necessary, which one should guide our judgment? This question would continue through centuries of philosophy. Modern rationalism would apply its confidence in reason to other problems, such as the origin of ideas, the certainty of knowledge, and the structure of reality. But Parmenides had already opened an important door by showing that philosophical thinking requires more than observation. It requires testing what appears before us against the standards of reason. For this reason, Parmenides' contribution is not limited to his theory of an unchanging being. It also lies in his intellectual courage to question what seems obvious. His philosophy suggests that truth may be hidden precisely where our senses seem to provide certainty. What appears obvious may still need to be examined by reason before it can be accepted as knowledge. And this tension is still relevant today. In many situations, appearance and reality do not match. Something can seem true, convincing, or obvious, and still require careful analysis. Parmenides leaves us with an uncomfortable but essential philosophical demand. Before asking only what we are seeing, perhaps we should ask whether what we believe we are seeing can truly be understood as true. There is a problem that appears whenever we try to turn perception into knowledge. What we see is constantly changing. A person grows older, a city changes, an opinion disappears, and an object wears down. For Plato, this instability of the sensory world creates a deep difficulty. If everything we perceive is subject to change, how can we find knowledge that is truly stable? His answer depends on a distinction that would become central in the history of philosophy: the difference between opinion and true knowledge. For Plato, doxa means opinion. It comes mainly from our everyday relationship with the sensory world. We may believe that something is beautiful, just, great, or good, because that is how it appears to us in a certain situation. The problem is that these judgments can change. Something considered beautiful by one person may seem ordinary to another. A decision seen as fair in one context may be considered unfair in another. Opinion remains tied to appearance, circumstances, and perspective. Episteme, on the other hand, represents true knowledge. It does not simply record what appears to the senses. It tries to understand what makes something what it is. Instead of asking only which actions seem just, Plato wants to know what justice itself is. Instead of listing beautiful things, he wants to understand beauty itself. This change may seem small, but it completely transforms the direction of the investigation. This is where Plato's famous theory of ideas or forms appears. According to Plato, the objects we encounter in the sensory world are particular, changing, and imperfect. The forms, however, are universal, stable, and understandable through the intellect. They are not simply images created by the imagination. They represent what allows us to rationally understand the common essence found in many particular examples. Consider beauty. We may encounter a beautiful song, a beautiful landscape, a beautiful person, or a beautiful work of art. These examples are very different from one another, and all of them can lose their beauty, be judged differently, or disappear. Plato then asks, what allows us to call such different things beautiful? His answer points to the form of beauty, an intelligible reality that does not depend on the changes experienced by particular examples. The same reasoning can be applied to concepts such as equality, justice, or goodness. In the Phaedo, Plato discusses the very idea of equality. Two objects may appear equal, but they never show absolutely perfect equality. Even so, we are able to recognize when something comes closer to, or moves farther away from that standard. For Plato, this suggests that the intellect has access to a concept of equality that goes beyond the objects observed by the senses. Here we can see his connection to what would later be called rationalism. Plato was not part of modern rationalism, but his philosophy shows a deep confidence in the ability of the intellect to reach truths that cannot be reduced to sensory experience. The senses can provide the starting point for many situations, but by themselves they cannot reveal the universal structure that makes knowledge possible. This superiority of rational knowledge does not mean that Plato considered perception completely useless. The sensory world can raise questions and inspire investigation. The problem begins when we confuse perception with understanding. Seeing many examples of courage does not mean knowing what courage is. Observing political decisions does not mean understanding justice. Gathering more experiences can broaden our view, but for Plato, knowledge requires thought to search for what remains common and intelligible. In the dialogue Meno, this confidence in the intellect appears in the famous discussion about the possibility of learning. Socrates guides an enslaved young man who has no formal mathematical education through a series of questions involving a geometric problem. Instead of simply giving him the answer, Socrates helps the young man recognize his own mistakes and move forward through reasoning. Plato uses this scene to develop his theory of recollection, according to which learning involves, in a certain sense, remembering truths that the soul is capable of recognizing through reason. The theory of recollection is connected to Plato's view of the soul. In the Phaedo, Plato argues that the soul has a special relationship with what is intelligible, unchanging, and eternal. The body, on the other hand, is connected to the sensory world, physical needs, and change. This contrast strengthens the idea that higher knowledge requires moving away from immediate appearances so that the intellect can understand what does not change. In Plato's philosophy, special importance is given to the form of the good. In the Republic, Plato gives the good a central role. It makes it possible to understand and organize the other intelligible realities. Just as light allows the eyes to see objects, the good allows the intellect to know what is true. It is not simply about everyday morality, but about a fundamental principle within his philosophy. For this reason, Plato's philosophy demands intellectual effort. True knowledge does not appear simply because an idea sounds appealing, or because many people agree with it. Plato is suspicious of the power of the majority when it is based only on customs, appearances, or persuasion. Reason must investigate whether there is a real foundation supporting what is being claimed. The distinction between doxa and episteme, therefore, is not just an academic classification. It represents two different ways of relating to the world. We can remain at the level of impressions, accepting what seems true, or we can ask about the reasons, definitions, and principles involved. For Plato, this second path is what brings the mind closer to knowledge. His influence on the rationalist tradition comes directly from this idea. Centuries later, modern philosophers would once again argue that reason has the ability to reach universal and necessary truths. Although Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz built systems very different from Platonism, all of them inherited, in some way, this confidence that the intellect does not have to remain trapped by sensory appearances. Plato presents us with a deeper requirement. It is not enough to have correct beliefs by accident. We need to understand why they are true. An opinion may match reality and still remain fragile if we cannot justify it. Knowledge begins when the mind stops simply recognizing answers and starts understanding the foundations that make those answers valid. In this sense, The superiority of rational knowledge in Plato does not mean rejecting the world we see. It means recognizing that what appears before our eyes may be only one part of what needs to be understood. Philosophy begins when the mind is no longer satisfied with particular examples and starts searching for the principle that makes them intelligible. It is in this movement, from appearance to essence, that Plato finds one of the highest tasks of human thought. The allegory of the cave is not just a famous image from ancient philosophy. It works as a thought experiment about reality. Plato presents it in Book 7 of the Republic as part of a larger discussion about education, knowledge, justice, and the development of the philosopher. Instead of giving an abstract definition, he creates a scene. Human beings are chained inside a cave, facing a wall, and unable to turn around to see what exists behind them. These prisoners can only see shadows projected onto the wall. Behind them is a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, people walk by carrying different objects. Since the prisoners have never known anything else, they believe those shadows are reality itself. To them, recognizing a shadow, predicting when it will appear, or identifying its movements may seem like real knowledge. The problem is that they understand only a very limited part of what actually exists. Plato creates this situation to show how familiarity can be confused with truth. A person can spend an entire life surrounded by the same beliefs, customs, and interpretations, and because of that, never realize that other possibilities exist. The cave does not represent only individual ignorance. It also represents a mental environment where repeated opinions begin to look like obvious truths simply because they have never been seriously questioned. Now imagine that one of the prisoners is set free. This moment is not comfortable. His eyes are used to the darkness. His body is used to being still, and his mind is used to the shadows. When he is forced to look at the fire and at the real objects that created those images, his first reaction would probably be confusion. What once seemed completely true begins to lose its certainty. This detail is important because Plato does not describe knowledge as something that is always pleasant. Learning can be painful because it requires us to give up old certainties. An old belief can feel safe even when it is false. When someone discovers that they are understanding something in a limited way, they may need to reorganize not just one idea, but part of their entire worldview. Philosophical education, then, involves disruption. The prisoner continues climbing until he finally leaves the cave. When he reaches the outside world, the sunlight initially makes it difficult for him to see. Little by little, he begins by looking at shadows, then reflections in water, then the objects themselves, and finally the source of light that illuminates everything around him. Plato turns this process into an image of the development of knowledge. We do not immediately jump from ignorance to complete truth. Understanding happens in stages. This movement can be described as appearance, reflection, rational knowledge, and truth. First, we accept what appears before us. Then we begin to question it. Next, we search for principles that can explain what we observe. Finally, we move toward deeper understanding. The allegory shows that philosophical thinking means breaking away from passive acceptance of appearances. Within the structure of the Republic, this image is connected to Plato's theory of knowledge. The shadows represent lower levels of understanding. The visible world gives us images and changing objects. Higher knowledge, however, depends on the intellect and on intelligible realities. A philosopher's goal is not simply to see better inside the cave, but to develop the ability to understand what makes knowledge itself possible. This is why the sun has a special meaning. Plato connects it to the form of the good, which holds a central place in his philosophy. Just as the sun makes visible objects possible to see, the good makes intelligible realities possible to know. This does not simply mean that the good is something pleasant or morally desirable. It works as a principle that gives knowledge clarity and direction. The allegory also reveals something important about the senses. Plato is not simply saying that seeing is useless. The problem is accepting what we see as the whole of reality. The prisoners do see something real. There really are shadows in front of them. The mistake begins when they conclude that nothing exists beyond those shadows. Perception gives us information, but it may reveal only part of reality. This difference helps explain why Plato became an important influence on later rationalism. Centuries later, modern rationalists would also question whether the senses could provide a strong enough foundation for knowledge. Descartes, for example, would begin his method by examining situations in which perception can deceive us. Although his philosophy is different from Plato's, both share a clear suspicion of appearances based only on the senses. However, the allegory of the cave goes beyond an abstract debate about the senses and reason. It also has a political and educational dimension. After discovering the outside world, the former prisoner must return to the cave. His eyes, now used to the light, would have trouble seeing in the darkness again. The other prisoners might interpret this difficulty as proof that leaving the cave harmed him. The situation becomes even more dramatic when he tries to explain that the shadows are not the whole of reality. The prisoners may reject him, make fun of him, or even react violently. Plato suggests that human beings do not always want to leave behind what they already know. A familiar lie can feel safer than a truth that demands change. But Plato is not teaching that anyone who disagrees with the majority automatically has the truth. That would be a shallow interpretation of the allegory. Leaving the cave requires education, intellectual discipline, and the ability to justify what one claims. Replacing a popular opinion with a personal belief that has no real foundation is not philosophical freedom. Reason must be trained. In the Republic, Plato gives great importance to mathematics, dialectic, and the education of the philosopher. Dialectic allows us to question assumptions, examine concepts, and move toward more fundamental principles. The philosopher is not simply someone who rejects appearances, but someone who tries to understand why a certain claim should be accepted as true. This is what makes the cave especially powerful. It is about intellectual transformation. Knowledge changes the person who gains it. After understanding that the shadows were only projections, the former prisoner can no longer see them in exactly the same way. Truth changes how he interprets what had always been right in front of him. The allegory of the cave remains relevant because it places a question mark over everything that seems too obvious. It does not tell us to automatically reject what we see, but it asks us to examine the limits of our perspective. What seems complete may only be partial. What seems obvious may depend on a limited point of view. In this way, Plato turns the search for truth into an inner journey. The real challenge is not simply finding new information, but learning to see differently. The journey out of the cave begins at the moment when what once seemed sufficient is no longer enough for the mind, and the need arises to fully understand what exists beyond the shadows. When rationalist philosophers look for a model of truly reliable knowledge, mathematics offers something that is difficult to find in other fields: necessity. A mathematical proof is convincing not because it seems likely, because many people agree with it, or because it has been observed many times. It is convincing because, starting from certain principles, the conclusion necessarily follows from them. This structure is exactly what fascinated thinkers such as Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. Consider a simple statement: 2 plus 2 equals 4. We can confirm this by counting coins, rocks, books, or any other objects. But this observation does not seem to be what makes the statement true. Even if nobody were counting anything at that moment, the relationship would still be valid. The rationalist sees an important difference here between observing a fact and understanding something that must be true. In everyday experience, many conclusions are temporary. We may observe that the sun has risen every day of our lives, but that repetition alone does not create the same kind of logical necessity found in a mathematical proof. Mathematics seems to offer something more solid, relationships that depend not only on what has happened, but on what must be true under certain conditions. This necessary character makes mathematics especially attractive to rationalism. If philosophy could discover principles as reliable as mathematical axioms, and develop conclusions through strict deduction, perhaps it would be possible to build a system of knowledge that was less vulnerable to error, opinion, and changing appearances. Euclid's geometry offers the classic example of this kind of organization. In his Elements, definitions and postulates serve as starting points, while theorems are proven through sequences of reasoning. For a rationalist, the appeal lies in this transparency. We can follow exactly how a conclusion comes from earlier premises. Nothing has to be accepted simply because it seems intuitive. The philosophical ideal then becomes similar. Establish clear principles, avoid contradictions, and move forward only when each step can be defended. This explains why mathematics is not simply one subject among many within rationalism. It represents a promise of intellectual order, an example of how the mind can build knowledge without depending entirely on changing sensory experiences or human opinions. René Descartes is one of the philosophers who expresses this ambition most clearly. His mathematical background deeply influenced the way he thought. In Discourse on the Method, he tries to establish rules that would allow reason to proceed in an orderly way, avoiding the acceptance of anything as true unless it appears clearly enough. Descartes admired the way mathematics advances step by step. A complex problem can be divided into smaller parts. Each stage can be examined, and conclusions can be connected in an organized sequence. His philosophical method tries to do something similar. Instead of collecting opinions, we should begin with secure foundations and move forward only when every step can be justified. This influence also appears in his analytic geometry. Descartes helped bring algebra and geometry together by showing that geometric figures could be represented through algebraic relationships. This ability to translate seemingly different problems into a common rational structure strengthened his confidence that reason could discover order where there had previously seemed to be only complexity. But there is an important difference. Descartes does not simply claim that all philosophy is mathematics. What he wants is a level of certainty comparable to mathematics. The question is methodological. Is it possible to find starting points in metaphysics and knowledge that are secure enough to allow us to deduce other truths without relying only on experience? Spinoza takes this inspiration even further. His main work, Ethics Demonstrated in Geometrical Order, is deliberately structured like a mathematical proof. He presents definitions, axioms, propositions, proofs, corollaries, and explanatory notes. This format is not simply a stylistic choice. It expresses his belief that reality has a rational structure that can be understood through necessary connections. When Spinoza discusses God, nature, the mind, the body, emotions, and freedom, he tries to show how his conclusions follow from principles presented earlier. Philosophy becomes like an architecture. Each proposition depends on others, and the reader is invited to follow the reasoning instead of simply accepting a statement because of the author's authority. This way of writing also reveals a particular view of truth. For Spinoza, to understand something properly means understanding why it is the way it is. A complete explanation does not stop at a surface-level description. It looks for the causes and necessary relationships that support the phenomenon. Leibniz shares this admiration for mathematics, but develops it in a different direction. A brilliant mathematician, he was one of the creators of differential and integral calculus. His philosophy searches for an intelligible reality governed by principles that reason can investigate. One of these principles is the principle of sufficient reason. According to Leibniz, nothing happens without there being a sufficient reason for why it is this way rather than another. Mathematics serves here as inspiration for a broader expectation, The universe should not be treated as an incomprehensible sequence of events. Reason should search for explanations. Leibniz also distinguishes between truths of reason and truths of fact. Truths of reason are necessary, and denying them leads to contradiction. Truths of fact, on the other hand, concern the way the world actually happened and could, in principle, have been different. This distinction shows why mathematics holds such a privileged position. When we prove a mathematical relationship, we are not simply saying that it usually works. We are saying that, given certain definitions and principles, denying the conclusion would create a contradiction. This is exactly the kind of necessity rationalists hope to achieve when investigating philosophical questions. They want to know whether there are truths about the mind, God, reality, or knowledge that can be established with the same level of certainty. However, this ambition also has limits. Philosophy deals with problems that cannot be treated exactly like equations. Concepts such as freedom, existence, and consciousness require arguments whose validity depends on premises that can be debated. A flawless deduction cannot save a system if its starting principles are questionable. For this reason, the mathematical model is both powerful and risky. It offers discipline, clarity, and rigor, but it can also create an illusion of certainty when the starting point has not truly been established. The great rationalists understood that the real challenge was not only to reason correctly, but also to discover which principles deserve to form the foundation of the system. The decisive question, then, is not simply whether philosophy can imitate mathematics in appearance, using definitions and proofs. The deeper question is this: are there philosophical truths that are necessary enough to support this kind of structure? It is this ambition that turns mathematics, within rationalism, from a tool for calculation into a true ideal of knowledge. At the beginning of the 17th century, European philosophy was going through a major transformation. Science was advancing, old authorities were being questioned, and new ways of studying nature were gaining strength. In this environment of intellectual uncertainty, René Descartes tried to answer a crucial question. If so many beliefs can be false, is there any absolutely secure starting point for knowledge? His answer would give rise to modern rationalism. For him, gaining knowledge meant starting over, even if that required questioning deeply rooted beliefs. Descartes was born in France in 1596 and received an education strongly influenced by the scholastic tradition. He studied at the Jesuit College of La Flache, where he learned logic, philosophy, mathematics, and theology. Despite this rigorous education, he gradually became dissatisfied with the large number of conflicting opinions he found in books. For him, having a great deal of knowledge did not necessarily mean having certainty. This dissatisfaction helps explain his philosophical project. Descartes did not want to simply add another theory to the many theories that already existed. He wanted to find a method capable of separating what could be known with certainty from what depended on habits, traditions, or rushed judgments. Philosophy, in his view, needed to rebuild its foundations. One of his early important works, Rules for the Direction of the Mind, already shows this concern. Descartes tries to establish guidelines for using reason correctly. According to him, the human mind should avoid confusing problems, divide difficulties into smaller parts, and move forward in an orderly way. Knowledge should not depend on intellectual luck, but on a disciplined method. This idea becomes more developed in Discourse on the Method, published in 1637. In this work, Descartes presents some of the central rules of his investigation. The first says that nothing should be accepted as true without sufficient evidence. The second recommends dividing each difficulty into smaller parts. The third says that thought should move from the simplest things to the most complex. The fourth requires complete reviews to make sure nothing has been left out. These rules show the influence of mathematics on his philosophy, but they also reveal something broader. Descartes believed that reason could be used in an organized way, reducing the risk of error. The problem was not simply whether someone was intelligent. The real challenge was learning how to use reason with discipline. The most radical step appears in Meditations on First Philosophy, published in 1641. In this work, Descartes decides to doubt everything that can possibly be questioned. He does not do this because he believes no truth exists. His doubt is strategic. By removing uncertain beliefs, he hopes to discover a certainty that can survive even the most extreme doubt. This process is directly connected to Cartesian foundationalism. We can imagine knowledge as a building. If the foundation is damaged, adding more floors only makes the problem worse. Before building anything, the ground must be examined. For Descartes, many beliefs accepted throughout life had never been properly questioned. It was necessary to return to the foundations. A similar metaphor appears in Principles of Philosophy, published in 1644. Descartes compares philosophy to a tree. Metaphysics would be the roots, physics the trunk, and the branches would represent other sciences, such as medicine, mechanics, and ethics. The image shows that, for him, different areas of knowledge should not remain completely separate. They needed to depend on common foundations. Metaphysics, therefore, holds a crucial position. Before deeply investigating the physical world, Descartes wants to know whether we can trust our own ability to know anything at all. This priority makes his project distinctive. The first problem is not determining which objects exist, but establishing which certainties can support any claim about reality. This is why he examines the senses so carefully. In some situations, perception can deceive us. Distant objects appear smaller, dreams can seem real, and certain experiences can be interpreted incorrectly. If a source has deceived us before, Descartes asks, can we treat it as an absolutely infallible foundation? His answer does not mean rejecting everyday experience. Descartes still recognizes its practical value. The point is that a philosophical foundation needs to provide a higher level of certainty. If something can reasonably be doubted, it cannot serve as the first principle. This requirement prepares the way for his most famous discovery, which will be explored more deeply later, the certainty of the thinking subject. When Descartes pushes doubt to its limit, he realizes that the very act of doubting requires thought. And if there is thought, there must be someone who is thinking. In this way, his foundationalist project finds its first solid point. But understanding Descartes only through the phrase, I think, therefore I am, would greatly reduce his importance. His goal is much larger. He tries to build a new view of knowledge, in which reason has the authority to examine beliefs, discover principles, and organize the sciences. This project also represents an important historical change. In medieval philosophy, many debates were organized around Aristotle and established theological traditions. Descartes does not completely reject the past, and he still discusses God and metaphysics. However, he shifts the center of investigation toward the rational subject and toward method. Authority is no longer enough simply because it is old or respected. A claim must have reasons strong enough to support it. This attitude helps explain why Descartes became a symbol of modern philosophy. Knowledge now requires justification before rational consciousness. At the same time, his rationalism should not be confused with the idea that the senses have no value at all. Descartes carried out scientific studies and was interested in anatomy, optics, and the physical world. The fundamental issue is the hierarchy of knowledge. When we are looking for absolute certainty, experience alone cannot provide the foundation he is searching for. His ambition is to create a stable foundation from which other truths can be rebuilt. First, find what cannot be denied. Then, establish reliable criteria. After that, move on to questions about God, the world, matter, and science. This organization reveals the deeper meaning of his foundationalism. This is also why his four major works complement one another. Rules for the Direction of the Mind examines how thought should be guided. Discourse on the method publicly presents his intellectual path. Meditations on First Philosophy explores the search for first principles in greater depth. Principles of Philosophy attempts to organize a broader view of knowledge and nature. Descartes therefore introduces a new philosophical demand. Before asking how many things we can know, he asks which kinds of knowledge truly deserve our trust. The value of a belief does not come only from seeming reasonable, but from the strength of the foundation that supports it. The birth of modern rationalism takes place in this act of reconstruction. Descartes turns doubt into a tool, reason into a standard, and solid foundations into a priority. His challenge remains demanding. If we removed from our beliefs everything we accept only because of habit, authority, or appearance, which certainties would truly remain standing? Cartesian doubt does not come from a desire to deny everything, but from the need to discover what can survive every possible question. Descartes realized that many beliefs enter our minds before we ever examine them. Some come from education, others from habit, and others from what we see and hear every day. If the goal is to build knowledge that is absolutely secure, then it is not enough to ask what seems true. We must test how far each belief can survive when it is subjected to doubt. This method appears clearly in Meditations on First Philosophy. Descartes decides to treat as temporarily false anything that gives him even some reason to doubt. The word temporarily is essential. He is not claiming that all his beliefs are false. He is suspending his trust in them so he can discover which ones remain solid. His doubt works like a filter. The more radical the test, the more valuable any certainty that survives it becomes. The first target is the senses. Much of what we believe about the world begins with sight, hearing, touch, smell, and taste. But Descartes points out that the senses sometimes deceive us. A distant object may look smaller than it really is. A tower seen from far away may look round and reveal a different shape when we get closer. If the senses have already deceived us before, would it be wise to consider them completely reliable? His first conclusion is cautious. Descartes does not say that everything we perceive is false. He recognizes that, under normal conditions, it would seem extreme to doubt that he is sitting near a fire or holding an object. But his method demands more than practical confidence. He is looking for absolute certainty. If there is any reasonable possibility of error, then a belief cannot serve as the final foundation of knowledge. The doubt then moves to a more disturbing level, the dream argument. While dreaming, we can talk, walk, feel fear, see places, and believe that everything is really happening. While we are dreaming, we do not always realize that we are asleep. So Descartes asks, what absolute guarantee do we have that our present experience is not also a dream? This possibility does not mean that our entire life is a dream. Its purpose is methodological. If we cannot always distinguish with absolute certainty between some dream experiences and waking experiences while they are happening, then the immediate evidence of the senses becomes even less secure as a philosophical foundation. What seems to be in front of us may not exactly match an external reality. Even so, dreams still seem to use more basic elements. We may dream about imaginary houses or impossible creatures, but perhaps colors, shapes, size, and quantity remain as basic components. This allows Descartes to consider that some truths, especially mathematical ones, may still remain certain. Whether someone is awake or dreaming, 2 plus 3 still seems to equal 5, and a square still has 4 sides. But Descartes has not yet reached the limit of his method. If he wants to find something absolutely impossible to doubt, he must ask whether even these apparently necessary truths could be questioned. This leads to a much more radical possibility. What if there were an extremely powerful being capable of manipulating his thoughts and making him wrong precisely when he believes he is reasoning correctly? In Meditations on First Philosophy, This possibility appears in the figure of the evil demon. Descartes imagines a powerful and clever deceiver determined to create illusions in his mind. Perhaps the external world is not the way he thinks it is. Perhaps his perceptions are being created for him. Perhaps even his most obvious reasoning is being manipulated. The idea may sound fantastic, but its purpose is not to describe a being that Descartes actually believes exists. The evil demon is an intellectual tool. It represents doubt taken to its highest level. Instead of asking only whether a particular sense can sometimes fail, Descartes asks whether his entire system of beliefs could be systematically deceived. In this way, he temporarily removes even the certainties that seemed most resistant to doubt. This helps us distinguish methodical doubt from permanent skepticism. A radical skeptic might conclude that we can never know anything. Descartes moves in the opposite direction. He uses doubt precisely because he believes some certainty can be found. His strategy is like a controlled demolition. Remove everything that is not strong enough and see whether there is a foundation that cannot be destroyed. For this reason, his doubt also follows certain rules. It is voluntary, temporary, and directed toward a specific goal. Descartes does not intend to live in complete paralysis, doubting whether he should eat, walk, or talk. His doubt belongs to philosophical investigation. In practical life, we continue making decisions based on experience and probability. But in the search for first principles, he demands a much higher standard of certainty. There is also an important psychological side to this method. Many beliefs feel secure simply because we are used to them. Descartes realizes that intellectually abandoning old habits is not easy. Even after forming a doubt, the mind tends to return to familiar opinions. The evil demon hypothesis also works as a way to keep the suspension of judgment active, preventing old certainties from automatically regaining their authority. This approach changes the very meaning of investigation. Before searching for new answers, Descartes examines the reliability of the tools he intends to use for knowledge. The senses can fail. Experience can be confused with a dream. Even reason itself is temporarily subjected to the extreme possibility of deception. Few philosophers have pushed the demand for a justified starting point this far. The philosophical value of this process also lies in reversing our normal attitude toward certainty. Usually, we try to protect what we believe. Descartes does the opposite. He deliberately searches for the strongest reasons to attack his own beliefs. If one of them survives, its strength will not come from habit, authority, or convenience, but from the rational impossibility of denying it. Doubt becomes a stress test applied to knowledge before any reconstruction begins. However, pushing doubt to the extreme creates an unexpected result. The more Descartes tries to doubt, the more obvious it becomes that some kind of activity is taking place. To be deceived, there must be thought. To doubt, the act of doubting must be happening. His method therefore begins to prepare the discovery of a certainty that no possible deception can eliminate. This tension is what makes methodical doubt so important. It does not end in emptiness. On the contrary, it creates the conditions for a first truth to appear with unusual force. The senses can be questioned, the world can be imagined as a dream, and a deceiver can be imagined, but the present act of doubting still requires something that doubts. The doubt that seemed to threaten all knowledge is about to reveal exactly the foundation Descartes was searching for. If there is a moment when Descartes' philosophy changes direction, it happens when extreme doubt stops destroying certainty and paradoxically begins to reveal one. After questioning the senses, considering the possibility that he might be dreaming, and imagining an evil demon capable of deceiving him, Descartes realizes that there is something even this possibility cannot eliminate: the act of thinking. This discovery appears in the Latin expression cogito, ergo sum, translated as I think, therefore I am. The phrase became one of the most famous statements in Western philosophy, but its meaning goes deeper than it may seem. Descartes is not simply saying that people who think exist. He is showing that, at the very moment he is thinking, his own existence becomes impossible to deny. The logic is straightforward. If Descartes doubts, then he is thinking. If he is thinking, then he exists at least as someone who thinks. Even if all his perceptions are false, even if the external world is not the way he imagines it, and even if a powerful deceiver is manipulating his mind, deception still requires someone who is being deceived. This is the strength of the cogito. The evil demon may deceive Descartes about the content of his thoughts, but it cannot make thinking happen without there being a thinker. The very attempt to deny his existence confirms what he is trying to deny. To say, "I do not exist," he would have to think that denial, and the thought itself would prove the existence of the thinker. For this reason, the cogito has a kind of certainty that is different from what the senses provide. A perception can be wrong. A memory can be false. A conclusion about the world can be corrected. But at the moment thought occurs, it is immediately present to the person thinking. Descartes therefore discovers a truth that does not depend on observing anything outside himself. It is important to understand that, for Descartes, "I think therefore I am," does not work exactly like an ordinary syllogism. He does not begin with a general premise, such as everything that thinks exists, then add, "I think," and finally conclude, "I exist." The certainty appears immediately in the very act of thinking. While he is thinking, he directly recognizes his own existence. In Meditations on First Philosophy, this discovery appears in the second meditation. Descartes asks whether, after doubting everything, anything certain still remains. At that moment, he realizes that whenever he thinks or states, "I am, I exist," that statement is necessarily true while he is thinking it. This introduces an essential feature of the cogito. Its certainty is connected to the present active thought. Descartes does not begin by proving that he has always existed, or that he will continue to exist. He establishes something more limited and more secure. While he is thinking, he cannot doubt that he exists. The strength of the conclusion comes precisely from this precision. But what is this I, whose existence has been discovered? At this point, Descartes cannot yet claim that he is a body, because the existence of the physical world is still in doubt. He also cannot rely on physical characteristics, since he has not yet proven that he has hands, a face, or any body outside his own consciousness. His first definition is therefore that of a thinking thing, the res cogitans. Thinking, in this context, does not mean only doing calculations or developing arguments. Descartes includes activities such as doubting, understanding, affirming, denying, wanting, imagining, and sensing. Everything that appears immediately in consciousness belongs, at this stage, to the realm of thought. This conclusion changes the center of philosophical investigation. Before proving the world, Descartes discovers the subject. Before establishing the existence of external objects, he discovers a consciousness whose existence is revealed through the act of thinking itself. This priority of the subject would have a major influence on modern philosophy. The cogito also shows why methodical doubt does not end in skepticism. If Descartes had only destroyed old beliefs, his investigation could have ended with the idea that knowledge is impossible. But doubt produces something that survives it. The more radically he tries to doubt, the more clearly he recognizes the existence of the one who is doing the doubting. It is as if doubt has reached its own limit. It can challenge everything outside the present act of thinking, but it cannot eliminate thought itself without contradiction. The tool created to test certainty therefore reveals the first certainty that passes the test. From this point on, Descartes gains a foundation for rebuilding knowledge. His foundationalist project needed exactly this, a truth that did not depend on other uncertain beliefs. The cogito takes on this role. It becomes the first principle from which Descartes can investigate new standards of truth and search for other certainties. This position explains why the cogito is so central to modern rationalism. Knowledge does not begin here with immediate trust in the sensory world. It begins with a truth discovered through rational reflection. The mind finds, within the act of thinking itself, a certainty that external experience could not provide. At the same time, Descartes does not intend to remain trapped forever within his own consciousness. The cogito is the beginning, not the final destination of his system. After establishing the existence of the thinking subject, he will try to prove the existence of God, defend the reliability of clear and distinct ideas, and restore the possibility of knowing the external world. Even so, each of these stages will bring new problems. Knowing that he exists while thinking does not automatically mean that everything he thinks is true. A person can exist and still be wrong about many things. The cogito guarantees the existence of the thinker, but it does not immediately guarantee the truth of everything contained in the mind. This distinction prevents a shallow interpretation of the phrase, "I think, therefore I am," does not mean, if I can imagine something, then it is real. It also does not mean that every thought is true. What cannot be doubted is the existence of thought as an activity, and along with it, the existence of the one who is thinking. The power of this discovery lies precisely in its simplicity. After an investigation that threatens to remove every certainty, Descartes does not find his first foundation in a distant object, a religious authority, or an ancient tradition. He finds it in the most immediate act of his own consciousness. With the cogito, modern rationalism gains a radically internal starting point. Certainty is born at the moment the mind realizes that not even the greatest imaginable deception can erase the fact that thinking is taking place. From this first foundation, Descartes can begin trying to rebuild what doubt had placed in suspension, and turn a single certainty into the basis of an entire system of knowledge. After finding in the cogito a certainty that cannot be denied, Descartes faces a new problem. Knowing that he exists while he is thinking is only the first step. If he wants to rebuild all knowledge, he must discover how to recognize other truths with the same level of certainty. This leads to a crucial question. Is there any standard that can distinguish a true idea from one that is merely convincing? Descartes' answer involves what he calls clear and distinct ideas. To understand this expression, it is important to see that Descartes is looking for more than a subjective feeling of certainty. A person can feel completely convinced and still be wrong. The standard cannot depend only on how strongly we believe something. It must be connected to the way the idea itself appears to the mind when it is carefully examined. An idea is clear when it appears directly and obviously to the mind. Descartes compares this clarity to the way a well-lit object can be seen by the eyes. The purpose of the comparison is not to turn thought into physical vision, but to describe the absence of confusion. When we understand something clearly, we know exactly what is being considered, without any essential uncertainty about its content. An idea is distinct when, in addition to being clear, it is sufficiently separated from all other ideas. It is not enough simply to perceive something. We must also understand its boundaries, its characteristics, and what makes it different from similar concepts. An idea may seem clear in one respect, while still being mixed with elements that do not actually belong to it. Distinctness requires precision. We can understand the difference through a simple example. A person may feel pain with extreme clarity because the experience is strongly present in consciousness. However, that does not mean the person has a distinct idea of the physical cause of the pain. They clearly know that they are feeling something, but they may not be able to identify exactly what is causing that sensation. This example shows that clarity and distinctness are not the same thing. Clarity refers to how directly and obviously an idea is present to the mind. Distinctness refers to how precisely that idea is separated from others. For Descartes, the most reliable knowledge requires both qualities working together. Mathematics once again holds a special place because it offers powerful examples of this kind of understanding. When we properly understand a geometric or arithmetic relationship, we do not depend only on sensory impressions. We can follow the elements of the problem, distinguish the concepts involved, and see how a conclusion follows from the premises. Consider again a simple statement such as 2 plus 3 equals 5. If the concepts involved are understood clearly and the relationships are properly distinguished, the conclusion appears to have a necessity that goes beyond particular observations. This is why Descartes admires mathematical proofs so much. They force thought to move forward in an organized way. Each step must be understood, and every conclusion must be connected to the reasons that justify it. This model fits perfectly with his goal of rebuilding knowledge on secure foundations. However, establishing the rule of clear and distinct ideas creates an important difficulty. During his methodical doubt, Descartes had imagined the possibility of an evil demon capable of deceiving him even in reasoning that seemed completely obvious. If that possibility is still open, how can he fully trust what he perceives clearly and distinctly? This is where the question of God enters Descartes' system. In Meditations on First Philosophy, Descartes tries to prove that God exists and that, being perfect, God would not systematically deceive us. The philosophical role of this conclusion is extremely important. It is meant to guarantee that what the mind perceives clearly and distinctly is not the result of a system designed to make error unavoidable. This move led to one of the most famous criticisms of Descartes, often called the Cartesian circle. The problem can be stated like this. Descartes uses clear and distinct ideas to prove the existence of God, but then uses God to guarantee the reliability of clear and distinct ideas. His critics ask whether this reasoning is circular. The issue is complex, and different interpretations have tried either to defend or criticize Descartes. Some scholars point out that he distinguishes between the certainty we have while directly thinking about a clear and distinct idea, and the later confidence we have when remembering those demonstrations. Even so, the problem shows that turning the cogito into a general standard of truth is not a simple task. There is another important aspect as well. For Descartes, clarity and distinctness require intellectual discipline. Many ideas seem obvious simply because they have been repeated for years. Habits, prejudices, and associations can make a belief feel natural without making it rationally clear. The Cartesian method requires us to slow down our judgment and carefully analyze what we are thinking. In Discourse on the Method, this concern appears when Descartes recommends accepting nothing as true unless it is clearly known to be true. We must avoid rushing to judgment and avoid prejudice, including in our conclusions only what appears to the mind so clearly and distinctly that there is no good reason to doubt it. This rule turns thinking into a practice of precision. When facing a claim, the question is no longer simply, "Does this seem correct?" Other questions must also be asked. Do I understand exactly what these concepts mean? Can I separate them from similar ideas? Do I know what reasons support this conclusion? Is there anything unclear hidden in the argument? The influence of this idea goes far beyond Descartes' own system. Even philosophers who reject parts of his philosophy often preserve the demand to define concepts, distinguish problems, and justify conclusions. The search for conceptual clarity would remain an important feature of many later philosophical traditions. At the same time, Descartes' standard does not mean that everything can be known easily. In fact, it makes investigation more demanding. A confused belief may be emotionally powerful, culturally accepted, and practically useful while still failing to meet the standard of evidence Descartes is looking for. We must also avoid another mistake. Clarity does not mean superficial simplicity. A complex idea can become clear when its parts and relationships are properly understood. In the same way, a short sentence can remain deeply confusing if the concepts involved are not clearly defined. The issue is not how simple or complicated the idea is, but how well it is understood. With clear and distinct ideas, Descartes tries to turn the certainty found in the cogito into a rule that can guide further discoveries. The challenge is no longer only to find something impossible to deny, but to learn how to recognize when the intellect has truly reached a truth. From this standard, his rationalism attempts to move from the first certainty toward a broader system in which knowing means not simply believing, but understanding with evidence and precision. Descartes realizes that not all ideas in the mind seem to have the same origin. Some appear when we come into contact with the world, others are created by the imagination, and others seem to belong to the rational structure of thought itself. This distinction is important for understanding why Cartesian rationalism does not consider sensory experience the only source of knowledge. For Descartes, the mind has its own resources that cannot be explained simply by what we see, hear, or touch. In Meditations on First Philosophy, Descartes examines the contents of his thoughts and tries to classify them. He calls adventitious ideas those that seem to enter the mind from something external. When someone sees a tree, feels the heat of a fire, or hears a sound, they form ideas that seem to depend on experience. These ideas are connected to the senses and to what is happening around us. However, Descartes remains cautious. Saying that an idea seems to come from outside does not immediately prove that there is an external object causing that idea. After methodical doubt, this conclusion still needs to be justified. A sensation can be present in the mind, even if its cause is different from what we imagine. For this reason, the term adventitious initially describes the way the idea appears to us, not an automatic guarantee of its true origin. A second group consists of factitious ideas. These are created by the mind itself from contents it already has. A mermaid is a simple example. We can combine the image of a woman with the image of a fish and mentally create a creature we may never have actually seen. The same happens when we imagine fantastic animals, impossible cities, or objects created by combining familiar elements. These ideas show that the mind is not simply a receiver of information. It also reorganizes, combines, and transforms what it already contains. The imagination can be creative, but that creativity does not mean that everything we imagine exists outside the mind. We can form a very detailed idea and still have no guarantee that anything corresponding to it exists in the world. The third category is the most important for rationalism: innate ideas. Descartes uses this concept to describe ideas or natural dispositions that belong to the rational nature of the mind itself. They are not simply copied from the senses or arbitrarily invented by the imagination. Instead, they are connected to the intellectual abilities that make it possible to understand certain fundamental concepts. Among the examples associated with Cartesian thought are the ideas of thought, extension, infinity, and God. The idea of thought is important because the cogito revealed the existence of the subject as a thinking being. Descartes does not need to observe an external object to recognize that doubting, affirming, denying, or understanding are forms of thought. Consciousness itself provides immediate access to them. Extension also holds a central place. For Descartes, the essential characteristic of matter is that it occupies space, has dimensions, and can be understood geometrically. When we think about physical reality in terms of length, width, and depth, we are using a rational structure that allows us to describe the physical world mathematically. This connects his metaphysics to his scientific project. The idea of infinity creates an even deeper problem. Descartes recognizes that he himself is a limited and imperfect being, yet he possesses the idea of something infinite. For him, this idea cannot be understood simply as a finite thing expanded without end. Infinity has an important conceptual priority because it allows us to recognize our own limitations by comparing ourselves with something that has no limits. This discussion leads to the idea of God. In the Meditations, Descartes defines God as an infinite, eternal, unchanging, independent, all-knowing, and all-powerful being. He argues that a finite mind could not be the adequate cause of an idea containing infinite perfection. From this, he tries to use the presence of this idea as part of his proof for the existence of God. This argument has received many criticisms throughout the history of philosophy, but its role in Cartesian rationalism is crucial. If certain ideas do not depend on sensory experience, then the mind may possess fundamental concepts that can serve as the basis for knowledge that is not simply a generalization from particular observations. This possibility is what makes innatism an important feature of rationalism. However, the expression innate idea can easily be misunderstood. Descartes does not necessarily mean that a baby is born consciously thinking about geometry, God, or metaphysics. Innatism can be understood as a natural disposition or ability of the mind to form and recognize certain ideas when reason is properly used. A comparison can help explain this difference. A person may have the ability to understand a mathematical rule even before explicitly thinking about it. Teaching or experience may activate that ability, but they do not necessarily create the rational structure involved from nothing. For the rationalist, experience can provide the occasion for the mind to recognize something that its own nature allows it to understand. This point separates Descartes from the empiricists who would later criticize innate ideas. John Locke, for example, would argue in an essay concerning human understanding that the mind is not born with principles already written into it, and would defend the fundamental importance of experience in the formation of our ideas. The debate between rationalism and empiricism would revolve around exactly this question. How much of knowledge comes from the senses, and how much depends on the structure of reason itself? The question is not only historical. When we recognize a mathematical truth, are we simply repeating patterns learned through experience, or are we understanding relationships that the mind can recognize as necessary? When we think about causality, identity, or infinity, are these concepts built entirely from sensations, or does the understanding contribute something of its own? The debate remains philosophically alive. For Descartes, recognizing innate ideas means accepting that the mind plays an active role in the construction of knowledge. It is not an empty surface that passively receives external impressions. It has its own ways of thinking, standards of evidence, and concepts that allow it to organize what appears in experience. This view strengthens the independence of reason. If some fundamental ideas belong to the rational structure of the mind, then certain truths can be investigated without depending entirely on the senses. Experience remains important for learning many facts about the world, but it is no longer the only possible source of understanding. Innate ideas, therefore, hold a strategic place in Descartes' philosophical system. They connect the cogito, metaphysics, mathematics, and the investigation of God. More than a list of concepts placed in the mind in advance, they represent the belief that thought has its own abilities to recognize principles that experience alone cannot fully explain. God does not play a secondary role in Descartes' philosophy. In Meditations on First Philosophy, God serves a crucial function, allowing Descartes to move from the isolated certainty of the cogito to a broader trust in reason. Descartes still has to answer a difficult question. How can he know that what he perceives clearly and distinctly is not the result of systematic deception? The evil demon hypothesis had pushed doubt to its limit. Descartes imagined a powerful being capable of making him wrong, even when he believed he was reasoning correctly. The cogito survives this possibility because even if he is being deceived, he must exist in order to be deceived. This is where the investigation of God becomes essential. Descartes begins by examining the ideas present in his mind. Among them, he finds the idea of an infinite, perfect, eternal, unchanging, all-knowing, and all-powerful being. He recognizes himself as finite, limited, capable of error, and subject to doubt. This raises a question. How could an imperfect being possess the idea of infinite perfection? To answer this, Descartes uses a causal principle. According to him, there must be at least as much reality in the cause as there is in the effect. Applied to ideas, this means that an idea with a certain content must have a cause capable of explaining that content. The human mind can create combinations of ideas, but Descartes believes that the idea of an infinitely perfect being could not be adequately produced by a finite mind simply from its own limitations. He argues that we do not create the idea of infinity simply by endlessly increasing what is finite. Instead, recognizing our own imperfection already seems to require some reference to perfection. We realize that we are limited because we are somehow able to conceive of something that has no such limits. For Descartes, then, the idea of infinity has significant philosophical importance. From this comes one of Descartes' arguments for the existence of God. If the idea of an infinitely perfect being is present in the mind, and if a finite cause is not enough to explain the content of that idea, then its ultimate cause must possess a corresponding level of reality. Descartes concludes that God exists, and that the idea of God was placed within us by this infinite being. This argument appears mainly in the third meditation, but Descartes also presents another line of reasoning. In the fifth meditation, he develops a version of the ontological argument. The basic idea is that existence belongs to the essence of an absolutely perfect being in the same way that certain properties necessarily belong to particular geometric figures. For Descartes, thinking of God as absolutely perfect while denying God's existence would be contradictory, because lacking existence would mean lacking imperfection. Existence, then, would not be a characteristic added later to the concept of God, but something inseparable from what it means to be absolutely perfect. These arguments are not meant only to prove a religious claim. They also have an important role in his theory of knowledge. If God exists and is perfect, then God cannot be a deceiver by nature. Deliberate deception would suggest some kind of weakness or imperfection. An absolutely perfect being would not have a nature compatible with systematic deception. This conclusion allows Descartes to weaken the evil demon hypothesis. The universe would not be structured by a principle whose purpose is to make the human mind inevitably wrong. If our mental abilities were created by a perfect God, then we have a basis for trusting them when they are used properly. This is where clear and distinct ideas receive their guarantee. Descartes had already recognized that the cogito was true because it appeared clearly and distinctly. He then expands this rule. Whatever we perceive clearly and distinctly can be accepted as true. The existence of a non-deceiving God is meant to guarantee that this trust is not simply a trap built into the structure of the mind itself. This does not mean that human beings never make mistakes. Descartes knows that we do. The question is how error can exist if we were created by a perfect God. In the fourth meditation, he answers by distinguishing between the understanding and the will. Our understanding is limited. We do not understand everything. Our will, however, can still affirm or deny things, even when our understanding does not have enough evidence. Error happens when we make judgments that go beyond what we understand clearly and distinctly. When we suspend judgment about what remains unclear, we can avoid error. God, therefore, would not be responsible for our mistakes. They result from the improper use of abilities that function correctly when kept within their proper limits. This point shows how religion, metaphysics, and the theory of knowledge are connected in Descartes' system. God does not appear as an isolated topic among many others. God's existence is used to support trust in the intellect, restore the validity of mathematics, and open the way toward proving the existence of an external world. Without this step, Descartes would remain trapped within a very narrow certainty. He would know only that he exists while he is thinking. With God as a guarantee, he believes he can gradually rebuild what doubt had placed in suspension. The cogito provides the first foundation. God's existence is meant to guarantee that reason, when operating clearly and distinctly, can reach other truths. However, this move receives serious criticism. One of the most famous objections is known as the Cartesian circle. Critics ask, if Descartes must trust clear and distinct ideas in order to prove that God exists, but then uses God to guarantee that clear and distinct ideas are reliable, is the argument not circular? Antoine Arnauld raised a similar objection in his responses to the Meditations. Descartes tried to answer by distinguishing between what we clearly and distinctly perceive in the present moment and what we later need to remember. The debate remained open and continues to be one of the classic problems in interpreting his philosophy. Another major criticism would later come from Immanuel Kant. In criticizing the ontological argument, Kant argued that existence is not a perfection or a predicate that can simply be included in the definition of something. According to Kant, defining a being as perfect would not be enough to prove that such a being actually exists outside thought. Even these criticisms show the importance of the Cartesian problem. Descartes understands that discovering one initial truth is not enough. He must also explain why our reason deserves to be trusted when it goes beyond that first certainty. God occupies exactly this strategic position. The role of God is to prevent knowledge from remaining permanently threatened by the possibility of universal deception. Understanding God in Descartes' system, therefore, requires seeing more than an argument for God's existence. God functions as a link between metaphysics and knowledge. If God is perfect and not a deceiver, reason can regain its authority. If that guarantee fails, the entire Cartesian system faces a central difficulty. This is why the discussion of God becomes one of the most ambitious and controversial parts of Descartes' philosophy. For Descartes, understanding the human being requires separating two realities that seem deeply connected in everyday experience, but have completely different natures. On one side is what thinks, doubts, imagines, desires, and perceives. On the other is what occupies space, has shape and movement, and can be described through physical relationships. This separation gives rise to the famous Cartesian dualism between mind and body. The first of these realities is what Descartes calls res cogitans, a Latin expression meaning thinking thing. It refers to the mind, consciousness, or the thinking subject. The cogito had already shown that Descartes could doubt the existence of the physical world, but he could not doubt that he existed while he was thinking. Mental activity, therefore, appeared as an immediate certainty. The second reality is res extensa, or extended thing. It refers to matter. Everything that occupies space belongs to this category. Rocks, trees, planets, machines, and also the human body. For Descartes, the essential characteristic of matter is not thinking, feeling, or desiring, but extension, meaning that it occupies space and has dimensions. The mind has no length, width, or weight. A thought cannot be measured with a ruler. A memory does not occupy a specific point in space in the same way a physical object does. The body, on the other hand, can be measured, divided, moved, and analyzed mechanically. Descartes reaches this distinction through his metaphysical investigation. He realizes that he can understand himself as a thinking thing even while continuing to doubt the existence of the body. If he can clearly understand the mind without referring to extension, and the body without referring to thought, he concludes that mind and body are truly distinct substances. For Descartes, God is the only absolutely independent substance. Mind and matter are created substances that depend on God, but are fundamentally different from one another. The essence of the mind is thought. The essence of matter is extension. This difference forms the foundation of Cartesian dualism. This separation is not simply a matter of terminology. It shapes how Descartes understands knowledge, human nature, science, and even the possibility of explaining our physical actions and everyday experiences. This separation also fits with the mechanistic science that was developing during the 17th century. Descartes believed that the physical world could be explained through laws of motion and relationships between bodies. Material nature did not need to be understood as something filled with hidden purposes or intentions. It could be studied as an organized system of matter in motion. In this context, the human body could also be studied as an extremely complex machine. Descartes describes bodily processes in mechanical and physiological terms. Movement, circulation, reactions, and many other functions could be explained without directly appealing to the soul for every physical event. However, a problem immediately appears. If mind and body have different natures, how can they interact? When someone decides to raise an arm, there seems to be a mental intention followed by a physical movement. When a person touches a hot surface, a physical event takes place that produces the conscious experience of pain. How can these two different realities causally affect each other? If something does not have a spatial location in the same way the body does, how could it push, move, or change a material structure? And how could a chain of physical events produce a subjective experience, such as fear, happiness, or suffering? Descartes recognizes that mind and body are closely united in human experience. He does not describe the human being simply as a mind controlling an external machine. In Meditations on First Philosophy, he says that he is not present in his body like a sailor in a ship. When the body is injured, we do not simply observe the damage intellectually. We feel pain. This suggests a deep union between the two dimensions. To explain this interaction, Descartes gives special importance to the pineal gland, a small structure located in the brain. He believed that it played a central role in communication between mind and body. In his work, The Passions of the Soul, he tries to explain how bodily movements, emotions, and conscious decisions are connected. Descartes believed that this structure might be suitable as a central point for coordinating bodily information and mental experience. But identifying a location does not completely solve the philosophical problem. Even if the pineal gland were involved in certain physical processes, the question would remain, how could something immaterial cause changes in something material? This difficulty was already recognized during Descartes' lifetime. Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia raised an especially important objection in her correspondence with Descartes. She asked, in essence, how a non-extended soul could cause a body to move. Her question directly targeted the weakest point of dualism. Physical causation normally seems to require some kind of relationship between things that have spatial characteristics. Descartes responded by arguing that we also know the union between mind and body through everyday experience, not only through abstract metaphysical concepts. Even so, his answers did not completely remove the difficulty. The problem of interaction continued to influence later philosophers. Some thinkers proposed different solutions. Malebranche developed occasionalism, according to which God would be the true cause, coordinating mental and physical events. Leibniz would propose his theory of pre-established harmony. Spinoza would reject the existence of two independent created substances and develop a monistic view instead. The debate continued through modern philosophy and eventually reached contemporary philosophy of mind. Today, questions about consciousness, the brain, and subjective experience remain closely related to the Cartesian problem. If mental processes depend on the brain, how do we explain conscious experience? Would a complete description of neural activity be enough to explain what we actually feel from the inside? These questions do not mean that all contemporary philosophy accepts Descartes' dualism. Many materialist theories argue that mental states depend entirely on physical processes. Other views try to preserve aspects of consciousness that cannot be fully reduced to the physical. The important point is that Descartes helped formulate, with remarkable clarity, a problem that has never completely disappeared. His dualism also left consequences for everyday language. We often speak of the body as something we have, and the mind as what we are. Even when we do not consciously accept Cartesian metaphysics, this separation still appears in the way we think about identity, responsibility, illness, and experience. Descartes' philosophical achievement lies less in having solved the problem than in making it impossible to ignore. By distinguishing mind and matter so clearly, he forced philosophy to explain how consciousness and the body can belong to the same human being. From that point on, any theory of the mind has had to face the same difficulty in one form or another, explaining how thoughts, sensations, and decisions relate to a physical organism that occupies space and operates through natural processes. Baruch Spinoza takes the rationalist project to a level that few philosophers dared to reach. While Descartes searched for secure foundations from which to rebuild knowledge, Spinoza tries to organize reality itself as if it could be demonstrated step by step. Instead of writing a philosophical work based only on explanations and discussion, he chooses a structure directly inspired by geometry. His goal is ambitious: to show that God, nature, mind, body, emotions, freedom, and ethics can all be understood through a necessary rational order. Spinoza was born in Amsterdam in 1632 into a Portuguese Jewish community. His education included religious studies, languages, and philosophy, but his thinking eventually followed a deeply independent path. In 1656, he was expelled from the Jewish community because of views considered unorthodox. After that, he lived a relatively simple life, working as a lens grinder and dedicating much of his time to philosophy. His most important work, Ethics Demonstrated in Geometrical Order, was published only after his death in 1677. The title already reveals the method. Spinoza does not present his philosophy as a collection of free reflections. The work is built with definitions, axioms, propositions, demonstrations, corollaries, and explanatory notes. His intention is for each conclusion to follow rationally from principles introduced earlier. This way of writing resembles Euclid's Elements. In geometry, we define concepts, establish principles, and prove theorems. Spinoza believes philosophy can also seek a similar kind of organization. If the concepts are defined precisely and the principles are correct, then the conclusions should follow through logical necessity. Truth would not depend on personal taste, tradition, or authority, but on the internal consistency of reasoning. It is important, however, not to confuse his method with a superficial attempt to make philosophy look mathematical. For Spinoza, the geometric form expresses something about reality itself. He believes that everything that exists follows a necessary order. Therefore, if reality has a rational structure, thought can try to follow that structure through equally organized demonstrations. This is where the radical nature of his rationalism becomes clear. Descartes still works with a distinction between different created substances, especially mind and body, along with God as an infinite substance. Spinoza rejects this multiplicity. For him, there is only one absolutely infinite substance, and everything else is a mode or expression of it. This idea will be explored more deeply later, but it already shows why his rationalism moves in a much bolder direction. For Spinoza, reason is not used only to discover abstract certainties. It should reveal why things are the way they are. To truly know something means understanding its cause, its necessity, and its place within the order of nature. An explanation that only describes an event is still incomplete if it does not show what caused it. This demand also appears in his analysis of human emotions. Spinoza does not treat passions such as anger, fear, hope, or envy as mysterious forces beyond reason. On the contrary, he tries to study them as part of nature. Instead of morally condemning emotions, he tries to understand their causes, their relationships, and the mechanisms through which they influence our actions. This attitude may seem cold, but it has a deeply human purpose. For Spinoza, understanding an emotion increases our ability to deal with it. When we are controlled by a passion we do not understand, we act more passively. When we recognize its causes, we become more capable of taking a rational role in our own lives. The ethics is divided into 5 parts, and this structure shows the scope of Spinoza's project. The first part deals with God, the second with the nature and origin of the mind, the third with the origin and nature of the emotions, the fourth with human bondage, and the fifth with the power of the intellect, or human freedom. Spinoza tries to connect all of these subjects within a single philosophical structure. This means that ethics, psychology, and metaphysics are not completely separate fields. The way we live depends on the way we understand reality. If we believe that we are completely independent of natural causes, we will interpret our choices in one way. If we understand that we are part of a much larger causal order, our understanding of freedom changes completely. This is why Spinoza's rationalism is often called radical. He does not use reason only to justify a few truths. He tries to bring almost all of reality under one unified rational explanation. Nothing should remain a mysterious exception simply because it is emotionally important or protected by tradition. This includes religious questions. Spinoza does not accept that God should be understood only through human images, as a ruler who decides, rewards, or punishes according to emotions similar to ours. His method tries to remove from philosophy ideas that depend on anthropomorphic imagination. God must be understood through reason, not projected in the image of human desires. This position made his work extremely controversial. For a long time, Spinoza was accused of atheism, even though his philosophy speaks constantly about God. The conflict comes from the fact that Spinoza's God is very different from the traditional personal God of many religions. His view challenges the idea of a divine being outside nature who intervenes in it from the outside. His radicalism also appears in the way he understands necessity. If everything follows from the nature of reality, then nothing happens in a completely arbitrary way. Events have causes. Human beings are part of this same order. Our desires, decisions, and emotions also have conditions and causes that can be investigated. For Spinoza, this does not mean that understanding necessity makes us powerless. In fact, the opposite is closer to his intention. The more we understand the causes that affect us, the more capable we become of acting according to proper understanding, instead of simply being carried along by impulses we do not understand. The geometric method serves exactly this view. Each proposition must show that a conclusion does not appear by chance. It must follow from something that came before it. The reader is invited to follow a chain of reasons. The intended result is to replace the impression of disorder with an understanding of necessity. Of course, this method has also received criticism. Many philosophers have questioned whether metaphysical concepts can really be demonstrated with the same necessity as geometric theorems. A demonstration may be formally elegant and still depend on definitions or axioms that can be challenged. A rigorous form does not automatically guarantee that the starting premises are true. Spinoza's radical rationalism comes directly from this confidence. If reality has order, then reason can search for that order. If our emotions have causes, they can be understood. If our beliefs contain confusion, they can be examined. For Spinoza, to philosophize is to transform dependence into understanding and replace fragmented explanations with a rational view of the necessity that connects everything. The idea of God no longer occupies a place separate from nature, and instead becomes identified with the infinite structure of reality itself. This change deeply transforms the traditional meaning of creation, causality, freedom, and existence. Instead of imagining God as a being outside the universe, watching it and intervening in it, Spinoza argues that everything that exists is in God and expresses God's nature. It is one of the boldest ideas in modern philosophy. To understand this proposal, we need to remember that Descartes distinguished between different substances. God was the infinite and absolutely independent substance, while mind and matter were created substances. The essential attribute of the mind was thought, while the essential attribute of the body was extension. Spinoza sees a problem in this structure. If a substance is truly something that exists in itself and is understood through itself, then it would not make sense to accept several independent substances. In the first part of the Ethics, Spinoza begins by defining substance, attribute, and mode. Substance is what exists in itself and is understood through itself. An attribute is what the intellect understands as forming the essence of a substance. A mode is a modification of substance, something that exists in something else and can be understood through it. From these definitions, Spinoza develops his monistic view. Spinoza concludes that there can be only one absolutely infinite substance. This substance is God. Here we reach the decisive break. Spinoza's God is not a cosmic craftsman who creates the universe from the outside. God is the infinite reality of which all particular things are modes. This is the meaning behind his famous expression, Deus sive natura, God or nature. This does not mean that every tree, rock, or person is God. The idea is more complex. Everything that exists within the one infinite substance and expresses aspects of it. Particular things are not independent substances. They are finite modes through which infinite reality is expressed. A person, an animal, or a planet exists, but does not exist by itself in the same way substance does. Spinoza distinguishes between natura naturans and natura naturata. The first expression, naturing nature, refers to nature as active, infinite, and self-caused reality. The second, natured nature, refers to everything that necessarily follows from that nature. This shows that God and nature are not simply two interchangeable words. For Spinoza, God has infinite attributes, although human beings know only two of them, thought and extension. Here he moves away from Descartes. Mind and body do not belong to two different substances. Thought and extension are attributes of the same infinite substance. Mental reality and physical reality are different ways of understanding one single reality. This idea solves the Cartesian problem of interaction between mind and body. If mind and body are not two separate substances, we do not need to explain how an immaterial substance can push or move a material one. For Spinoza, the order of ideas and the order of bodies correspond because both express the same reality under different attributes. This view also changes the way we understand causality. God does not create the world at a certain moment through a free decision similar to human choices. Everything follows necessarily from divine nature. God could not simply decide to produce a completely different reality if God's nature is what it is. The existence of the world follows from the necessity of infinite substance itself. This is where Spinoza's philosophy becomes uncomfortable for traditional religious views. A personal God is often understood as choosing, desiring, rewarding, punishing, and intervening. Spinoza believes that assigning human passions to God means projecting our own psychology onto infinite reality. God does not love, hate, or change intentions the way a human being does. This does not mean that Spinoza is trying to diminish God. From his perspective, the opposite is true. Imagining God as an enlarged human ruler would limit what is supposed to be infinite. An absolutely infinite being could not be controlled by desires, frustrations, or emotional changes. God's perfection consists precisely in existing according to the necessity of God's own nature. This position helps explain why Spinoza was considered dangerous by many of his contemporaries. His philosophy was accused of atheism, even though God occupies a central place in his system. The problem was the very different meaning he gave to the word. For his critics, identifying God with nature removed God's personality and transcendence. This is why Spinoza is often described as a pantheist. Pantheism is the idea that God and the universe are identified with each other. The expression Deus sive natura seems to support this interpretation. However, many scholars consider this label incomplete because Spinoza's nature cannot be reduced to the collection of physical objects we see. Infinite substance has infinite attributes, while human beings know only thought and extension. Therefore, saying that God is the material universe would oversimplify his philosophy. Some interpreters prefer terms such as panentheism or Spinozist monism, although none of these labels completely settles the debate. The safest term is monism. Spinoza rejects the existence of several independent substances and argues that there is only one fundamental, reality. Everything that exists must be understood through this unity. The diversity of the world does not disappear, but it is understood as a multiplicity of modes of the same substance. This unity does not erase the differences we see in the world. Instead, it tries to explain them without treating every individual thing as an independent reality, disconnected from the infinite principle on which it depends for its existence. This view also has ethical consequences. If we are part of nature, then we are not a separate kingdom within it. Our desires, emotions, and actions have causes. Human beings are no longer a metaphysical exception, standing above natural laws. We are finite expressions of the same order that produces everything else. Understanding this changes our relationship with events. Instead of imagining that nature should adapt itself to our desires, Spinoza asks us to understand the causes and necessities that shape what happens. Our frustration increases when we judge reality only according to what we wish it were. Deus sive natura, then, represents much more than a provocative phrase. It captures a major transformation in metaphysics. God is no longer outside reality. Mind and matter are no longer separate substances. Events no longer depend on arbitrary decisions. And human beings no longer occupy an exceptional position outside the natural order. Spinoza therefore offers a view in which knowing God means understanding reality itself and its necessary relationships more deeply. The more we understand nature, its causes, and our place within it, the more adequate our knowledge becomes. In his system, the distance between theology, metaphysics, and science becomes much smaller, because all of them are trying to understand expressions of the same infinite reality. Spinoza begins his discussion of freedom by challenging a very common belief, the idea that we are free simply because we feel that we are making choices. For him, this feeling is not enough. We may be aware of our desires, decisions, and impulses, but we often do not understand the causes that produce them. It is precisely in this difference between knowing what we want and knowing where that desire comes from that one of the most provocative ideas in his philosophy appears. In Ethics Demonstrated in Geometrical Order, Spinoza argues that everything that exists follows necessarily from the nature of God, or nature. Nothing happens completely by itself, without a cause, or outside the order of reality. Every event depends on other events. Every body is affected by other bodies, and every mental state is connected to earlier causes. This view is deeply deterministic. In simple terms, it means that everything that happens has specific causes and does not simply come from nowhere. This applies to physical events, but also to our emotions, thoughts, and decisions. Human beings do not occupy a special position outside nature. We are part of the same causal order that includes everything else. This is where Spinoza comes into conflict with the traditional idea of free will. Many people believe they are free because they can say, "I chose to do this." But according to him, knowing that we made a choice does not mean understanding why we made it. We may strongly desire something and believe that the desire appeared spontaneously, when in fact it was produced by experiences, emotions, habits, expectations, and circumstances that we do not clearly recognize. Spinoza offers a famous comparison. Imagine a stone being thrown through the air. If that stone had consciousness, it might believe that it continues moving because it wants to go in that direction. It would be aware of its movement, but unaware of the force that set it in motion. For Spinoza, something similar happens to us when we are aware of our desires, but do not understand their causes. This idea can sound threatening. If everything has causes, is freedom just an illusion? Spinoza gives a surprising answer. No. The mistake is defining freedom as the absence of causes. For him, nothing that exists can act outside nature. True freedom must be understood in a different way. To be free, in Spinoza's view, means increasingly acting according to our own nature, as understood through reason, instead of being passively carried along by external causes and emotions we do not understand. Freedom does not eliminate causality. It increases our understanding of the causes involved in our actions. This difference appears in his distinction between action and passion. When we are an adequate cause of what happens within us, we are closer to action. When we are controlled by emotions whose origins we understand only partially, we remain in a more passive state. Spinoza calls this domination by the passion's human bondage. The word bondage is important because it shows that the problem is not having emotions. Spinoza does not propose eliminating feelings or turning human beings into cold, emotionless creatures. The problem begins when we are ruled by emotions we do not understand. A person controlled by jealousy, for example, may believe they are acting freely while their decisions are actually being driven by fear, insecurity, and assumptions they have never examined. The same applies to anger. Someone may believe they consciously chose to respond aggressively, but they may actually be reacting to a chain of causes involving wounded pride, past memories, frustrated expectations, and rushed interpretations. The less they understand this process, the more passively they take part in it. Reason can transform this relationship. When we identify why a certain emotion appeared, it becomes less mysterious. Understanding does not mean making it disappear immediately, but it changes our position toward it. Instead of simply suffering its effects, we begin to recognize the network of causes that produced it. This is why knowledge and freedom are deeply connected in Spinoza. The more complete our understanding becomes, the greater our ability to act according to reasons we understand. A person who recognizes the mechanisms behind their fear has more ways to respond than someone who simply obeys that fear without knowing where it comes from. Spinoza also connects this issue to the conatus, a central concept in his philosophy. Everything strives to continue in its own existence. In human beings, this effort appears in our desires, impulses, and search for things that increase our power to act. But not every desire truly makes us stronger. We can seek things that make us more dependent, anxious, or passive. Reason helps us distinguish between what increases our power and what makes us more dependent on external causes. A person may believe they will be free once they receive constant approval from others, but the more their self-worth depends on that approval, the more vulnerable they become to other people's opinions. In this sense, freedom does not mean getting everything we want. It means understanding our own desires more deeply. This reversal is one of Spinoza's most important contributions. Instead of asking only, "Can I do what I want?" he leads us to ask, "Why do I want what I want?" This question transforms ethics. A person may have many choices and still live in an extremely passive way. For Spinoza, having more options is not the same as having rational freedom. We should also not confuse his determinism with fatalism. Fatalism would suggest that nothing we do matters, because everything is simply destined to happen anyway. Spinoza does not defend this kind of passivity. Our thoughts, studies, relationships, and decisions are also causes within nature. Understanding a situation can change what we do next. Reason, therefore, does not remove us from the chain of causes. It becomes part of that chain in a more conscious way. Learning, reflecting, and understanding can change how we respond to our emotions. Necessity does not eliminate transformation. It simply means that every transformation also has its own conditions and causes. The more we understand these conditions, the less we depend on imaginary explanations about ourselves. We stop thinking of ourselves as an empire within an empire, separate from nature, and recognize that our mental life exists within causal relationships that are just as real as any other natural process. Spinoza therefore redefines freedom as both an intellectual and ethical achievement. We are not free because we escape causes, but because we can understand some of them and act with greater awareness. Bondage begins with ignorance of the forces that move us. Freedom grows as we turn that ignorance into understanding. Far from reducing human life to simple fate, Spinoza's determinism demands a different kind of responsibility. Instead of celebrating a supposedly uncaused will, he invites us to investigate the causes behind our emotions, habits, and decisions. For Spinoza, the more clearly we understand this network of causes, the less we are simply carried along by it, and the more rationally we participate in what we become. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz enters the history of rationalism with a unique ambition: to explain why things are the way they are, and not some other way. For him, accepting that something simply happened without looking for a sufficient reason means giving up on the investigation too early. Reality should not be seen as a chaotic collection of disconnected facts, but as an order that, at least in principle, can be understood through reason. Leibniz was born in Leipzig in 1646 and was an extraordinary intellectual figure of his time. He was a philosopher, mathematician, lawyer, diplomat, historian, and student of logic. He worked in many different fields with one basic conviction: complex problems can become clearer when we discover the principles that organize them. This confidence helps explain why he holds a central place in modern rationalism alongside Descartes and Spinoza. His philosophical work is spread across books and texts of different kinds. Among the best known are the Monadology, Discourse on Metaphysics, New Essays on Human Understanding, and Theodicy. In all of them, we find the same search for the intelligibility of reality. Leibniz wants to know not only what exists, but also why it exists in this particular way. This is where the principle of sufficient reason becomes important. In simple terms, it says that nothing happens without there being a sufficient reason for why it is this way rather than another. The principle does not mean that we immediately know those reasons. It means that whenever something exists or happens, we should assume that there is some basis capable of explaining why it happened. Imagine finding a door open in an empty house. We may not know who opened it or why, but our ignorance does not turn the open door into an event with no explanation. We look for a cause because we expect there to be some reason for that situation. Leibniz extends this demand to reality itself. This idea expresses the rationalist spirit. Thought should not be satisfied with the statement, "That is just the way it is." When faced with a fact, reason asks, "Why?" When faced with something that exists, it asks, "Why does it exist?" When faced with a difference, it asks, "Why did it happen this way rather than another?" Philosophy begins to search for foundations, relationships, and causes that make reality understandable. Leibniz combines this principle with another equally important one, the principle of non-contradiction. According to this principle, a statement cannot be both true and false in the same sense. It is fundamental to what Leibniz calls truths of reason, whose denial would produce a contradiction. The principle of sufficient reason, on the other hand, becomes especially important for understanding contingent truths and facts about the world. The distinction is essential. Some truths seem necessary. A triangle cannot have four sides and still be a triangle. But many events could have happened differently. A person could have chosen another career. A battle could have ended another way, and a tree might not have grown in that exact place. In these cases, it is not enough to look for a contradiction. We need to discover why one possibility became reality, This is where Leibniz's principle becomes powerful. Even when something is not logically necessary, there must still be a sufficient reason explaining why it happened. The world contains contingency, but that does not mean it lacks explanation. For Leibniz, contingent does not mean irrational. This demand leads to one of the most famous questions associated with Leibnizian philosophy. Why is there something rather than nothing? The question takes the principle of sufficient reason to its most radical level. If every contingent reality needs an explanation, then simply pointing to another equally contingent thing seems insufficient, because we could continue asking for the reason behind that thing as well. Leibniz finds the ultimate foundation of this chain in God. God would be a necessary being whose reason for existing does not depend on anything outside itself. The world, by contrast, is contingent. Different possible worlds could have existed, but God would have had a reason for creating this particular one. In this way, the principle of sufficient reason connects Leibniz's metaphysics with his theology. This argument is related to his idea of the best of all possible worlds. The phrase is often reduced to a caricature, as if Leibniz were saying that the world is perfect or that suffering does not matter. His position is more complicated. He recognizes the existence of evil and suffering, especially in theodicy, but tries to explain how a perfect God could create a world that contains them. Leibniz argues that God considers all possibilities and chooses the reality with the best possible combination of order, diversity, and perfection. This does not mean that every individual event is good. It means that, when reality is viewed as a whole, there would be a sufficient reason for choosing this world rather than other possible worlds. This solution received criticism. Voltaire, for example, mocked Leibnizian optimism in Candide, especially in the face of real tragedies. The criticism asks whether trying to rationally justify the world as a whole risks minimizing the real weight of suffering. Even so, the debate shows how far Leibniz was willing to take his demand for explanation. The principle of sufficient reason also has a scientific side. Studying nature means rejecting the idea that events simply happen without any basis at all. We search for patterns, causes, and conditions. Although modern science does not necessarily accept Leibniz's complete metaphysical system, the demand to ask for the reasons behind phenomena still has a clear connection with scientific investigation. But Leibniz does not believe that the human mind can know every reason that exists. Reality may be infinitely complex, and human knowledge is limited. There is a difference between saying that an explanation exists and being able to discover it completely. Leibnizian rationalism is optimistic about the intelligibility of reality, not about human beings being all-knowing. This distinction prevents an important misunderstanding. The principle does not promise that every question will receive a quick answer. It establishes an intellectual direction. We should not turn our ignorance into proof that no reason exists. Not knowing why something happened is different from proving that it happened without any explanation at all. For Leibniz, then, rationality means searching for the foundation that turns an isolated fact into part of an order that can be understood. His philosophy refuses to accept arbitrariness as the final answer. Even when different possibilities could have existed, there must be something that explains why one of them became real. This confidence is what makes the principle of sufficient reason one of the strongest expressions of rationalism. The world is not treated as a mystery that must remain completely impossible to understand, but as a reality open to investigation. For Leibniz, philosophical thinking means continuing to ask for reasons until we reach foundations capable of explaining not only how things happen, but why they are exactly the way they are. Leibniz's philosophy becomes more precise when he asks whether all truths have the same kind of necessity. His answer is no. Some statements are true in such a way that their opposite is impossible. Others are true because events happened in a certain way, even though they could have happened differently. From this difference comes the distinction between truths of reason and truths of fact, one of the most influential contributions of his philosophy. Truths of reason are necessary. This means they do not depend on the particular circumstances of the world in order to be true. Their denial leads to contradiction. When we say that a triangle has three sides, we are not simply describing what we have observed in many drawings. We are expressing something contained in the very concept of a triangle. If a figure has four sides, it may be another kind of figure, but it will not be a triangle. This is where Leibniz uses the principle of non-contradiction. A necessary proposition is true, because denying what it says would lead thought into inconsistency. We do not need to travel around the world looking at every triangle that exists to confirm how many sides they have. Reason can recognize this truth by analyzing the concept itself. Mathematics offers examples of this kind of knowledge. Arithmetic and geometric relationships can be demonstrated rationally without depending on an endless series of observations. For Leibniz, this shows that the mind is capable of reaching truths whose validity goes beyond particular experience. They would be true in any possible world where the concepts involved kept the same meaning. Truths of fact have a different nature. They describe events, situations, or states of affairs that actually happened, but whose opposite does not contain a logical contradiction. Saying that Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo is historically true. However, we can imagine without contradiction a world in which the battle ended differently. The defeat happened, but it was not logically necessary, in the same way that a triangle must have three sides. This difference between necessity and contingency is crucial. A contingent truth does not become less true simply because it could have been different. What changes is the kind of explanation it requires. To discover a mathematical truth, we can rely on rational analysis of concepts. To know who won a battle, we need history, testimony, documents, and evidence from the world. Leibniz, however, does not consider truths of fact to be events without any foundation. This is exactly where his distinction connects with the principle of sufficient reason. If something happened in a certain way, there must be a sufficient reason for why it happened that way rather than another. Contingency does not mean the absence of a cause or explanation. Consider a human decision. Someone could have followed different paths, but made one specific choice. For Leibniz, this choice belongs to the realm of truths of fact. Its opposite can be imagined without contradiction. Even so, there must be reasons, motives, circumstances, and conditions that explain why that particular decision actually happened. Truths of reason can, in principle, be reduced to identities through analysis. Leibniz believes that if we break down a necessary proposition far enough, we eventually reach concepts whose relationship becomes obvious. This is why the principle of non-contradiction provides their foundation. If we deny the necessary relationship, we end up claiming something that is incompatible with the very concepts we are using. With truths of fact, the situation is more complex. The analysis of reasons can continue indefinitely because every event is connected to a chain of earlier conditions. For the human mind, this network may be impossible to understand completely. God, however, according to Leibniz, would have perfect knowledge of all these relationships and would be able to understand the sufficient reason behind every contingent event. This position allows Leibniz to preserve both rational order and contingency at the same time. The world does not have to be logically necessary in every detail in order to remain intelligible. Different worlds could have been possible, but only one became actual. Philosophy, therefore, asks why this particular set of events exists instead of other possibilities. The distinction is also connected to Leibniz's idea of possible worlds. A truth of reason remains valid in every possible world. There is no possible world, for example, in which a true contradiction could exist while the same concepts keep the same meaning. A truth of fact, however, can vary between different possibilities. Napoleon could have won at Waterloo in another possible scenario without destroying logic. This idea allows Leibniz to separate what must happen from what simply happens. The difference may seem simple, but it has major consequences for metaphysics, science, logic, and the philosophy of religion. If everything were necessary, there would be no contingency. If everything were simply contingent and had no reason, reality would lose the intelligibility that Leibniz considers fundamental. There is also an important connection with experience. Leibniz is a rationalist, but this does not mean that he rejects observation or historical investigation. For human beings, experience is essential for knowing truths of fact. We cannot deduce from the definition of a person alone where they were born, which decisions they made, or what events they experienced. We have to discover those facts. The rationalist element appears when Leibniz argues that even in these cases, facts are not intellectually arbitrary. Experience tells us that something happened. Reason asks why it happened. In this way, perception and thought perform different roles. One gives us particular information, while the other searches for principles, relationships, and explanations. This distinction would deeply influence later philosophy. David Hume, although an empiricist, would develop a distinction between relations of ideas and matters of fact that in some ways resembles Leibniz's division, although it belongs to a very different philosophical project. Later, debates about analytic, necessary, contingent, and possible truths would continue in logic and the philosophy of language. Immanuel Kant would also return to the problem by distinguishing different kinds of judgments and asking how necessary knowledge is possible. In the 20th century, philosophers would again debate whether logical necessity, metaphysical necessity, and analytic truth mean exactly the same thing. Leibniz's distinction, therefore, opened a field of discussion that continued to be reformulated long after his time. What first appears to be a simple classification actually reveals two different ways in which something can be true. Some truths carry their necessity within the structure of the concepts themselves. Others depend on the concrete history of the world, but still require reasons that explain why they became real. With Leibniz, simply saying that a statement is true is no longer enough. We must ask what kind of truth it is, whether its opposite is really impossible, and what foundation explains what actually happened. This demand turns truth into a question of structure, possibility, and reason, showing that fully understanding something also means understanding either why its denial would be contradictory, or why, among several possibilities, that particular fact became real. The Monadology, written by Leibniz in 1714, presents one of the most original ideas in modern philosophy. Instead of imagining reality as being made only of extended matter, physical bodies, and movement, Leibniz argues that everything that exists ultimately comes from fundamental metaphysical units, called monads. They are not physical particles, they do not occupy space, and they cannot be divided. Instead, they are simple centers of perception and activity. The word monad comes from the Greek word monos, meaning unity. This name helps explain its role. For Leibniz, something that is truly simple cannot have parts. If it had parts, it could be divided and would no longer be simple. For this reason, monads are indivisible. This also means that they cannot be destroyed by ordinary physical processes. A body can be broken, cut, or separated because it is made of parts. A monad, because it has no parts, cannot be divided in this way. Leibniz believes that monads can only begin or end through creation or annihilation. Monads are also immaterial. They have no size, shape, weight, or spatial location in the same way a physical object does. This may seem strange, especially because Leibniz wants to use these units to explain a world that we experience as material. The key is understanding that, for him, the most fundamental level of reality does not have to possess the same characteristics as the visible world. The material world we experience is an expression of a deeper order made up of these simple units. Bodies appear as organized collections and phenomena, but their ultimate metaphysical reality depends on monads. In this way, Leibniz tries to go beyond a purely mechanical description of matter and explain what exists at the most fundamental level. Each monad is also a center of perception. Here, perception does not necessarily mean clear consciousness like human awareness. Leibniz uses the term in a broader sense. A monad internally represents the universe from its own point of view, even though many of these representations are unclear and confused. This means that different monads have different levels of perception. Some have extremely unclear perceptions. Others, such as those associated with animals, have a higher degree of perception and memory. In human beings, Leibniz recognizes an even higher level connected to reason, reflection, and the ability to understand necessary truths. He therefore distinguishes simple perception from apperception. Perception is the internal representation of many things within the unity of a monad. Apperception involves awareness or reflection on that perception. Not every perceptual activity reaches the level of consciousness. This idea allows Leibniz to explain what we might today call unconscious or barely conscious perceptions. He speaks of small perceptions, experiences so weak that we do not notice them individually, but which can combine to produce a conscious experience. A famous example is the sound of the ocean. We hear the overall sound of the waves without consciously distinguishing every individual sound. A monad, then, is not something static. It constantly moves from one perception to another. Leibniz calls the internal principle that drives this movement appetite, or appetition. Each monad contains within its own nature a tendency that guides its changes. This detail becomes essential because Leibniz makes a surprising claim. Monads do not directly cause changes in one another. He uses the famous image that monads have no windows. Nothing literally enters them from the outside, and nothing leaves them to directly change another monad. This immediately seems to create a problem. If monads do not interact, how can we explain the coordination we see in the world? When someone decides to raise a hand, it seems that a mental decision causes a physical movement. When the body is injured, a conscious experience of pain appears. In everyday life, everything seems to involve mutual influence. Leibniz answers with his theory of pre-established harmony. According to this idea, each monad develops its own series of internal states, but God created all monads in such a way that these series correspond perfectly with one another. There is no direct transfer of causes between them. Instead, there is a coordination established from the moment of creation. A traditional comparison helps explain this idea. Imagine two extremely accurate clocks that always show the same time. At first, someone might think that one clock is constantly adjusting the other, but they could simply have been built and synchronized so perfectly that they remain in agreement without directly communicating with each other. For Leibniz, something similar happens between mind and body. A mental decision and a physical movement appear coordinated, not because an immaterial mind physically pushes the body, but because their series of states correspond according to the harmony established by God. This solution offers an alternative to Cartesian dualism. Descartes had separated mind and body and then faced the vacade problem of explaining how two such different substances could causally interact. Leibniz tries to avoid this difficulty by denying direct interaction altogether. At the same time, he rejects the occasionalism of philosophers, such as Malebranche, according to which God constantly intervenes to coordinate mental and physical events. For Leibniz, God does not need to perform a new act of intervention at every moment. The perfection of creation lies precisely in having established a complete enough order from the beginning. Pre-established harmony is also connected to Leibniz's idea that every monad expresses the entire universe. This does not mean that each monad consciously knows everything. It means that its state is related to every other event in reality, even though many of these relationships are represented in an extremely unclear way. Each monad expresses the same universe, but from a different point of view. Leibniz compares this to a city seen from different places. The city remains the same, but someone standing on a hill, someone walking along a street, and someone looking through a window will each have a different perspective. No single view captures the whole. This variety of perspectives allows Leibniz to preserve both unity and diversity. There is one ordered universe, but it is expressed through an enormous number of individual centers. Each monad has its own internal history and its own way of representing the whole. God once again plays a fundamental role in this system. As a perfect and all-knowing being, God would know every possibility and establish a harmony among the monads that produces an ordered universe. This coordination is not accidental. It is part of the rational structure of reality. This is why the monadology is connected to the principle of sufficient reason. If the universe has a particular order, there must be a reason for that organization. For Leibniz, the harmony among different perspectives cannot simply be an unexplained accident. The theory also shows how far his rationalism moves away from a purely materialist view. Fundamental reality is made up of centers of representation and activity, not lifeless pieces of matter. What we experience as physical bodies is only one level of the world's order. Even though contemporary science does not accept monads as physical entities, their philosophical importance remains. Leibniz is trying to solve questions about unity, identity, perception, causality, and the relationship between mind and matter. His answer turns reality into a network of coordinated perspectives without direct causal contact. The monadology, then, presents a universe in which every being carries within itself its own way of expressing the whole. No monad needs to receive instructions from the others in order to remain connected to the general order. The correspondence already belongs to the structure of creation. In this way, Leibniz imagines a reality in which unity and multiplicity exist together because of a rational organization so deep that every individual perspective follows, in its own way, the movement of the entire universe. In the 17th and 18th centuries, one of the major debates in modern philosophy brought two traditions face to face, rationalism and empiricism. Both were trying to answer the same question. Where does human knowledge come from? Rationalists emphasized reason and intellectual principles capable of reaching necessary truths. Empiricists, on the other hand, argued that our knowledge begins with experience, and that the mind should not be assumed to contain ideas that have never come, in some way, through the senses. The opposition may seem simple, but it requires some care. Rationalists such as Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz did not deny that experience was useful. They studied the world, science, and natural phenomena. The difference was that they believed certain truths could not be explained by observation alone. Mathematics, for example, seemed to have a necessity and universality that no limited series of experiences could fully guarantee. Empiricists agreed that reason was necessary for organizing ideas, comparing information, and building arguments. What they questioned was the existence of innate ideas or knowledge independent of experience. For them, we should not begin by assuming that the mind already contains fundamental principles. We need to ask how our ideas actually reach us. John Locke developed this criticism in a major way in an essay concerning human understanding, published in 1689. One of his main targets was the doctrine of innate ideas. Locke argued that there are no theoretical or moral principles universally present in human consciousness from birth. If such principles were truly innate, we would expect children and people without particular education to recognize them clearly. This is where the famous image of the mind as a tabula rasa, or blank slate, appears. The expression should not be understood to mean that the mind has no abilities of its own. Locke recognizes mental operations such as comparing, combining, abstracting, and reflecting. What he rejects is the idea that specific contents are already written into the mind before experience. For Locke, our ideas come from two main sources. The first is sensation, through which we receive information from contact with the world. Colors, sounds, temperatures, textures, and movements reach the mind through the senses. The second is reflection, through which we become aware of the operations of the mind itself, such as thinking, wanting, or remembering. Experience, then, includes both what we perceive externally and what we observe in our own mental activity. This position directly conflicts with Cartesian innatism. Descartes believed that certain fundamental ideas, such as infinity and God, could not be explained simply through sensory experience. Locke tries to show that complex ideas can be built from simpler materials acquired through experience. In this way, what appears to be innate may actually be the result of later combinations and abstractions. George Berkeley would take empiricism in a more radical direction. He accepts that all knowledge begins with perception, but questions the very idea of matter existing independently of all perception. His famous phrase, esse est percipi, is usually translated as to be is to be perceived. For Berkeley, what we know directly are ideas present in the mind, not some supposed material substance hidden behind them. This does not mean Berkeley believes the world is simply imaginary. He argues that our perceptions have order and regularity, and his philosophy gives God an important role in maintaining that stability. His criticism is directed at the idea of matter as something completely independent of perception, while also being something we could never directly perceive. David Hume pushes empiricism toward even more challenging conclusions. In works such as An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding and A Treatise of Human Nature, he distinguishes between impressions and ideas. Impressions are more vivid experiences, such as present sensations and emotions. Ideas are weaker copies of those impressions when we remember or imagine them. Hume uses this distinction as a test. When we encounter a philosophical concept, we should ask which impression it comes from. If we cannot identify any corresponding experience, we may be using words without sufficiently clear meaning. This method produces a powerful criticism of many traditional metaphysical claims. The case of causality is especially important. When we repeatedly observe one ball strike another, and the second begin to move, we see a sequence of events. But do our senses show us any necessary connection between cause and effect? Hume says no. We only observe events that regularly occur together, and we develop the mental habit of expecting one to follow the other. This conclusion challenges a central ambition of rationalism. If necessary causal connections are not directly found in experience, how far can reason go in claiming that nature contains necessary relationships? Hume shows that many beliefs that seem rationally certain may actually depend on habits formed through repetition. The difference between the two traditions can be summarized without turning either one into a caricature. For empiricism, the basic sequence is experience, ideas, and knowledge. For rationalism, reason and intellectual principles allow us to reach knowledge whose necessity cannot be reduced to particular observations. The conflict appears mainly in three questions: the origin, limits, and justification of knowledge. Regarding origin, the question is whether all ideas come from experience or whether there are elements that exist a priori. Regarding limits, the debate concerns what we can know beyond what we directly perceive. Regarding justification, the problem is what makes a belief rationally secure. Mathematics clearly illustrates the tension. An empiricist must explain how we reach universal and necessary statements from particular experiences. A rationalist must explain why the principles used by the mind genuinely correspond to reality instead of being merely internal constructions. There is also the problem of science. Observation is essential for investigating nature, which supports the empiricist approach. But science also depends on mathematics, inference, and principles that go beyond immediate perception. In practice, reason and experience work together. For this reason, the image of a simple war between two opposing sides can be misleading. Descartes carried out scientific investigations. Leibniz valued observation. Locke used abstract reasoning. Hume developed rigorous arguments. None of them believed that human beings should use only the senses or only reason in every situation. The real debate is about which of these abilities provides the foundations of knowledge and how far each one can go. Rationalism worries that experience alone can never produce universal necessity. Empiricism worries that reason, when separated from experience, can build elegant systems with no guarantee that they actually correspond to the world. This debate would change philosophy. By forcing each tradition to confront its own limits, rationalists and empiricists prepared the way for a new question. What if knowledge requires both what we receive through experience and structures supplied by the mind to organize that experience? It is from this very conflict that one of the most influential answers in modern philosophy would emerge. At the end of the 18th century, Immanuel Kant entered the debate between rationalism and empiricism with the sense that both sides had recognized an essential part of the problem, but neither offered a complete answer on its own. On one side, rationalists showed that reason has its own structures, and that certain truths seem necessary. On the other, empiricists insisted that knowledge begins with experience. Kant tries to bring these two insights together without simply mixing them. His work, Critique of Pure Reason, grows out of this difficulty. Kant wants to discover how knowledge is possible, what its limits are, and how far reason can legitimately go. He does not ask only what we know, but what conditions make it possible for us to know anything at all. This is the context for one of his most famous statements. Although all our knowledge begins with experience, it does not follow that it all comes from experience. The sentence may sound paradoxical, but it summarizes his position. Without experience, there would be no content for us to know. But experience alone does not explain the form through which that content becomes organized and understandable to us. Kant therefore distinguishes between what we receive and what the mind provides. The senses give us data, but that data does not arrive as fully formed knowledge. For experience to have order, the mind must structure it. Knowing, then, is not simply passively recording the world. It also means organizing what appears to us according to certain conditions that come before experience. These conditions are called a priori. Something a priori does not simply mean an idea that we think before having any experience in a chronological sense. It means something whose validity does not depend on particular experiences, and that functions as a condition for experience itself to be possible. Kant tries to show that the mind has forms and concepts that actively contribute to the creation of knowledge. In sensibility, he emphasizes space and time. For Kant, space and time are not learned simply by observing the world. They are forms through which objects can appear to us. Everything we perceive externally appears within spatial relationships, and every experience takes place within a temporal order. Space and time therefore function as a priori structures of sensibility. Then the understanding enters the picture. Kant argues that the mind also organizes experience through categories such as causality, substance, unity, and plurality. These categories are not taken directly from sensations. They are fundamental concepts that allow us to connect and organize the information we receive, turning a scattered series of impressions into a coherent experience. Causality provides a crucial example. David Hume had argued that we do not perceive a necessary connection between cause and effect. We only observe events repeatedly occurring in a certain sequence. Kant agrees that causal necessity is not simply found in the senses. But instead of concluding that it is only a habit, he argues that causality is a structure of the understanding used to organize experience. This response reveals Kant's synthesis. From empiricism, Kant keeps the idea that we cannot know objects without experience. From rationalism, he keeps the idea that the mind has principles that do not simply come from sensations. Knowledge is created through the cooperation between what we receive and what our own ability to know contributes as a form. For this reason, Kant rejects both dogmatic rationalism and radical empiricism. Reason cannot simply produce knowledge about anything by examining its own concepts alone. At the same time, experience is not an unorganized collection of impressions from which all knowledge is mechanically extracted. Sensibility and understanding must work together. This position appears in another famous statement by Kant: "Thoughts without content are empty, and intuitions without concepts are blind." Without information from experience, concepts would have no objects to apply to. Without concepts, what we receive through the senses would not form organized knowledge. This change also redefines the relationship between the mind and reality. Kant calls his proposal a Copernican revolution in philosophy. Instead of assuming that knowledge must simply adapt itself to objects as they exist independently of us, he asks whether the objects of experience must fit the conditions through which our minds are capable of knowing them. This does not mean that we freely create the world. Kant distinguishes between phenomena and things in themselves. A phenomenon is an object as it appears within the conditions of our sensibility and understanding. The thing in itself is reality considered independently of those conditions. We can know phenomena, but we cannot claim to know things in themselves exactly as they exist outside any relationship with our human way of knowing. This is where Kant places limits on rationalism. Reason has enormous power, but it is not unlimited. When it tries to go beyond all possible experience and prove, through concepts alone, questions such as the ultimate nature of the soul, the totality of the universe, or God, it risks producing metaphysical illusions. This criticism directly challenges earlier philosophical projects. Descartes tried to prove the existence of God and the distinction between soul and body through metaphysical reasoning. Leibniz built explanations involving substances and possible worlds. Kant recognizes the greatness of these systems, but asks whether reason went beyond the limits within which its concepts can be legitimately applied. At the same time, Kant does not destroy the rationalist legacy. He preserves one of its most important insights: the mind is not passive. There are a priori structures, necessary principles, and rational conditions without which experience could not become knowledge. Mathematics and certain fundamental principles of science still possess a kind of necessity that cannot be explained simply by repeated observation. His solution, however, changes the meaning of that necessity. Instead of saying that reason simply discovers the structure of things as they exist in themselves, Kant asks which structures belong to our own way of knowing. Necessity may reveal something, both about the objects of experience and about the conditions that make that experience possible for us. After Kant, the legacy of rationalism is no longer simply the belief that reason can reach truths independently of the senses. It also becomes the investigation of the structures that reason itself contributes to knowledge. The question changes. It is no longer enough to ask what the mind knows. We must also discover what the mind necessarily does in order for any knowledge to exist. Kant does not end the debate between rationalism and empiricism by declaring a winner. He shows that the opposition was incomplete. Experience provides what we know, while the mind provides the conditions through which we are able to know it. With this synthesis, reason keeps its importance, but loses the right to move forward without limits. Its strength now depends on recognizing how far it can legitimately go. If you made it this far, thank you for joining me on this journey through the philosophy of rationalism. From Parmenides and Plato to Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, and Kant, We have seen how one question has continued across centuries. How far can we trust reason to understand the truth? Now I want to hear your opinion. Which of these ideas stood out to you the most? Descartes' method of doubt? Spinoza's God or nature? Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason? Let me know in the comments. If this video helped you better understand rationalism, leave a like, because it helps this content reach more people who are interested in philosophy. Subscribe to the channel for more videos and to keep exploring the ideas of the great philosophers in a clear and in-depth way. And if you know someone else who enjoys philosophy, share this video with them. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. And don't leave the channel just yet. Choose one of the next videos and continue this journey through philosophical thought. See you in the next one.